Chapter 241, Resilience. January 5th, 626. I stood before 6 different tables, all holding trays of different materials. Some special herbs, bottles of chemicals, canisters of liquid white crystals sitting at authority 10, the bone marrow of a female lord beast, the paragon of vigor. There was also a canister filled with a mixture of liquid white crystal and the same female lord beast's ovaries. It was supposed to help with retaining the potency of Amara's reproductive system. Only one of 2 things that would hopefully prevent her from becoming sterile. The second was the invocation. Amara was to receive a body enhancement primarily focused on resilience, not strength. She wouldn't become like a knight, but her healing factor would be boosted and her body would be able to handle the strain of what her magic usually imposed. She had told Terrace about her aura and the effects of using her hypercomplex magic, and after the operation it wouldn't get much better. But with the invocation, she'd be able to bear the strain better, hopefully unlocking the full extent of what her aura should afford her. As a secondary effect, it would also protect the systems that weren't supposed to be affected by this operation. And finally, there was the King Blood corpse. It was no longer the intact corpse it once was. It had been thoroughly processed and purified. Some of it was still corrupted, because apparently part of receiving a crown was allowing the material to corrupt the body and change it before then purifying it and making it yours. It was what happened to my eyes and why they had melted within my sockets, though I didn't know that's what was going on at the time. But the scale of this operation was much larger. Amara's entire body would be undergoing changes, from her feet to her hair. It would modify her cardiovascular system, morphing her into a specimen that could manipulate mana with her very body acting as the conduit. Terrace had done this operation many times before. King Bloods of Unholy Light were a coveted resource by the Church and every warlock within its military precisely because of how beneficial their crowns were. While one this powerful didn't show up often, it wasn't unheard of, and for them it was almost routine. The difficulty came in the form of saving Amara's fertility, as well as incorporating the invocation. It was experimental ground for them, but I trusted in their expertise, mainly because I was told invocations couldn't exactly go wrong. The worst that could happen would be the invocation simply failing to take and Amara going sterile. But we were both prepared for that outcome, because regardless, she'd be getting the crown. Now she just needed to get through the operation. I looked away from the tables of materials and toward Amara, who laid on an operation table in nothing but a thin gown. She was very obviously anxious, but unlike me, she wouldn't have to be conscious for this whole operation. Only the latter part. She reached out, and I gave her my hand so she could hold it. After that, Terrace walked over. "We are ready to begin." I glanced at him, seeing all the other personnel around the tables. There were 6 of them, the best that the Church could offer. This was a big operation and a major learning opportunity for everyone involved, so they were all more than willing to be here. There was also the Sovereign a few feet away, standing there quietly. I wasn't sure of her actual name. She seemed to have been raised in secrecy because I didn't see any mention of her in the database either. All I knew was that she was called Halolite. She was dressed in thick plain white robes with no adornments to speak of. Her hands were covered in gloves. She wore what looked like white combat boots based on the rugged boot I saw peek out from under the robe, and she wore a head covering with a veil that covered everything but her black eyes, her iris speckled with white. From that, and what little I saw of her skin, she seemed to have albinism. No wonder she was completely covered. She noticed my gaze and took a step, reaching out with her hand and speaking with a hoarse voice. "I am Halolite. John, thank you for being here. It is my pleasure. I try to handle all high-profile crown operations, and since this one is unprecedented, I am happy to be here and learn." I shook her gloved hand, noticing some cushion between the exterior leather and her hand, probably some form of cotton on the inside. But her grip was strong, surprisingly so. She was definitely tempered by vigor, and based on the boots and the mannerisms I could observe so far, she was active military. Probably with the order, since I hadn't seen anything about her. I directed her to Amara so the 2 could exchange some words. Halolite was good at reassuring, so Amara's anxiety lessened substantially. With that, I gave Terrace a nod. "All right, it is time to begin. Put her to sleep." Amara's grip on my hand tightened as one of the personnel brought her a pill. Amara took a breath and opened her mouth. The pill was placed on her tongue, and it started dissolving immediately, sinking straight into her bloodstream. She quickly became drowsy, her hand loosening, until she finally passed out. Her breathing became even, and I let go of her hand, placing it on the bed by her side. And so it began. I had already been briefed on everything that would happen, as had Amara. They first hooked her up to an 4 and started streaming in a small amount of authority, 10 liquid white crystal. I could sense its power stream through her body, going from her arm vein to her heart before being pumped through the rest of her body. The magicka density within her body rose rapidly as they continued to inject the white crystal. I had been under heavy strain, but thankfully Amara didn't have to deal with that. She'd have to deal with a lot of pain when she woke up instead. Several minutes went by, around a quarter of the liquid white crystal supply being injected into her body before they finally brought out the first material. Some people started grinding up materials and mixing it with odd liquids. I knew alchemy was a thing, but I had learned little about it. These people were mixing up some of the materials on the spot, the new mixtures being injected into the 4 and into her body. The first mixture made her skin flush, her heart pumping faster and her breathing quickening. For a second I worried about hyperventilation but stamped down my concerns and let the professionals do their thing. After that came the Lord Beast's bone marrow. A dozen large and small syringes came out, and I had to back away as Terrace and his doctors surrounded Amara's body. They removed her gown, exposing her nude body, and started injecting the bone marrow mixture into her limbs. They took several minutes to inject at least a portion of the mixture into every bone in her body, without exception. From her skull to her finger bones, every bone received at least some of the bone marrow, the needles being driven straight in with ruthless intention. They flipped her over and did the injections into her spinal column as well. It made me queasy, but I made sure to watch and visualize everything. Finally, once they had precisely injected all of the bone marrow mixture, Terrace personally moved on to utilize the ovaries. He mixed the Lord Beast's ovaries with a mixture of special herb solutions and liquid white crystal, taking the resulting viscous liquid and casting magic over her womb. The organ was highlighted with magic, and with that, Terrace used a special tool to inject the liquid through her canal. The liquid was absorbed once it hit the womb and ovaries, taking but a minute to disappear into her body. It was over quickly, and everyone finally moved on. Now was the hard part. Terrace brought over the main material, the processed corpse of the king blood of unholy light. Half of the corpse was refined into a dark purple poisonous liquid. The other half came in the form of a special organ. The special organ was unique to the king blood. Terrace said that they had purified the king blood's dark crystal and then integrated it into the organ. Amara's foci was also integrated, broken down, and added to the white crystal as a raw enhancement. Once it was integrated with Amara's body, the still poisonous organ would process the white crystal itself, purify itself consequently, and become a part of her body. The only reason it wouldn't be rejected was because of the poisonous liquid. That was the part that would corrupt her body, changing her, allowing the crown to take hold. It was a controlled mutation, treading the line between human and corrupted. The woman who pioneered this shit was a psycho. Make the incision, Terrace called, picking up the organ. It was shaped like a heart, with long vessels coming off of it. I had been assured that it wasn't actually the king blood's heart and cardiovascular system. However, one of the doctors finally brought up a blade and made a cut below her sternum. They opened her up from there and inserted the new organ, a bit smaller than Amara's heart. Then they started making more cuts and running the vessels across her body. It looks like they had precisely extracted the organ from the king blood because it was obvious which vessels had to go where. Some went down her arms and legs, some wrapped around her heart, and some went up toward her skull. Hallolite had to do some healing to close her up after some deep and dangerous cuts were made, but otherwise, everything fell into place better than I thought it would. Still, long cuts were made everywhere, and Hallolite's healing wouldn't help for what came next. Terrace finally brought up the dark solution, loading some into a syringe and placing the needle between the ribs. Then he pushed the needle straight into her heart, using magic to highlight it. The dark solution was injected straight in. The other doctors started taking full syringes of the solution and injecting it into her bone marrow as well, using the previous routes that gave her the Lord Beast bone marrow. The solution acted fast. I could feel the new organ inside her light up with magic as it interacted with the solution, acting as a guideline. It started corrupting her body quickly, traveling throughout her entire cardiovascular system within a minute or so. The vessels that came from the new organ started to sprout and spread, filling her limbs like veins and capillaries, even connecting to the arteries across her body, though it didn't transport blood. No, the new organ was responsible for injecting magic straight into her blood, using her blood as a convenient conduit for mana, turning her body into a living foci. All right, let's get the invocation installed. Terrace started moving with urgency, injecting the rest of the solution while the others started bringing over the rest of the materials. My eyes widened when I saw what would be used to implant the invocation. Elemental crystals and vigor crystals. Not like the ones Son Industries had manufactured, that we had invented, but natural ones. I knew they had to be natural because of their shape. The ones from Son Industries were always a perfect sphere, unblemished and pure. But these were shaped like organs or geodes, as if they had come out of animals or naturally mined. I connected the dots quickly. The pillars of creation didn't have white crystals like we did. They had elemental, vigor, and psychic crystals, and they didn't have crests, but invocations. I recalled the book that Aki translated for me, and suddenly realized what I had been looking at. There were many names in there that I had no idea about, primarily for materials used in the installation of an invocation. They called the crystals different things, not simply a vigor crystal or the like. That's why it didn't ring any bells when I dove deep into enchanting and advanced. Despite the translation, the vocabulary still hid its own secrets. But now I knew. I had unintentionally created a bridge between the two different magic systems. Sure enough, Terrace also took out some pure elemental and vigor crystals, ones they had obviously recently made with my knowledge. Then, he used a tool to melt down both and engrave them into Amara's skin. He carefully drew a formation into her abdomen, back, and then up to the back of her neck. It ended at the base of her skull. It was intricate, not enough to confuse me since nothing could be more complex than my advancement formations. Still, it took Terrace 3 hours to complete the invocation. Once finished, the entire thing flashed with magic, melting into her skin. For a few minutes I watched it diffuse into her body, but it still left behind visible inscriptions, just like what I had seen on Aki. These were bright red, like fresh arterial blood. Once it was finished integrating, Terrace lifted his hands and backed away. All right, the transformation is progressing as expected. The crown and invocation are installed as expected. My work is done. Now, it's up to Amara. He suddenly looked at me. We're going to wake her up. You said you can help her activate the invocation? Not directly, but I'll make sure she isn't overwhelmed by the pain. Go ahead and wake her. Very well. Terrace nodded toward one of his doctors, who brought over another pill, slipping it into Amara's mouth. I stepped behind Amara's body, placing my hands against her head as she was mercilessly brought to wakefulness. Her face contorted, groans seeping out, getting louder as the pain settled into her nervous system. She didn't speak, forced to revel in the pain until I could get a hold of her mind. Tears fell, and I was finally able to push myself into her mind. Find me, Amara. It hurts. Fuck, it hurts. I know it hurts, but you need to focus. You've got an invocation to activate. I spoke and filled her mind with illusions, firing off bursts of visualizations to make her think about the invocation and her aura. Invocations were controlled directly by one's aura. That was why I had sensed an incredible aura from Aki when I last saw her, one I hadn't sensed at all before that. Amara was definitely able to do it. The issue was the lack of experience. She had never handled an invocation before, and it would be like learning to control a new limb. But it was for the sake of having children, a thought I used in order to sharpen her up. I also used my aura to suppress hers, confining it to her body where she would best feel the invocation. John, I can't. It hurts. You can and you will. Focus on your back and stomach. It's there. I started spamming more visualizations, causing her to go mute as the thoughts distracted her from the pain, just slightly. What was also transmitted was my urgency. If she wanted kids, she needed to do this. For a few minutes I could feel Amara's thoughts move away from the pain and toward the invocation. That's when I saw it glow above her abdomen. That's it. Don't stop now. I started reducing the visualizations so that she could focus on what only she could see and feel. The invocation glowed stronger, Terrace smiling. Good. She needs to keep that going until the transformation finishes. Come on, babe. I tried to soothe her mind with my power as she struggled to concentrate. Unfortunately, This wasn't a fast process, even after the 3 hours it took to install the invocation. The dichotomy of corruption and purification within her body continued for hours more. Terrace also injected more liquid crystal, the remainder that sat at Authority 11. Thankfully, using aura was only a matter of concentration, not energy use. I was gradually able to soothe Amara's mind directly, filling it with more reward than pain by focusing her thoughts on the healing and protection aspect of the invocation and distracting from the pain the transformation and liquid crystal caused her. Still, hours of constant horrible pain took its toll on her. By hour 3, she was getting exhausted, but I kept pushing her, even if I had to force her awake with small streams of my psyche. I wouldn't let her regret not doing everything she could. She just needed support, which was what I was here for. This process also gave a good glimpse into what the corrupted had gone through. Forced, unguided mutation designed to twist the human image and torture their mind and body. This was a glimpse at that reality. Over time, I could see her body start to take on visual changes. Her hair fell out first, and her skin went deathly pale. The new organ and its magic vessels glowed so bright that I could see them continuing to grow under her skin. Her finger and toenails all fell out, most of her skin peeling and becoming raw. Her muscles also spasmed, requiring others to pin her down lest she thrash around. With my hands on her head, I could also feel her pulse, and it surpassed 200 BPM, sitting at 250 for far longer than I was comfortable with. The worst thing that happened was when she started vomiting chunks of something, including blood. Terrace had warned me it would happen, but I still had the thought that she was actually dying. Perhaps she was. Finally, at hour 7, when every inch of skin had peeled at least one layer, and she seemed to vomit up all of her intestines, the transformation finished. Amara's invocation started doing more healing than protection, and since she was no longer being corrupted or purified, Halolight was able to step in and assist in the healing, using the remainder of the overloading magicka within her to assist. It was slow, but any remaining scars from the incisions and injections were healed and wiped away like they had never happened. She was left bald, with raw skin and no nails on her fingers or toes. And she was beautiful. I caressed her temples and finally let her rest. She passed right back out, and I stepped away. Terrace waved. Let's get her cleaned up. This operation has been a success. Chapter 242, Evil Plan. January 6th, 626. My eyes opened a few seconds before Amara started shifting. We were still in the medical ward of the Franks Tower since Terrace wanted to observe her for a day or two before letting us go. She had been out for 18 hours so far, only just now waking. I pulled myself out of the field bed I had set up in the room. No way was I sleeping in a stiff chair. Once beside Amara's bed, I grabbed her hand. She clenched it as she woke up, eyes fluttering open. I made sure it was dark in the room, because although her eyes hadn't changed visually, her vision was certainly much better than before. I didn't want her senses to be overwhelmed like mine had been back then. She found me with her eyes and stared at me for several seconds before lifting her arm and looking at it. Her skin was certainly paler than before, but ever since the transformation stopped, she regained some healthy, supple color. Still, losing a layer of skin left her looking like a delicate, sheltered girl who hadn't seen the sun in all her life. She had been reborn. How are you feeling? Amara looked back at me when I asked, taking a few seconds to formulate her words. I don't know. Her voice came out slightly different from what I was used to. It was smoother, lacking any of the harshities earned by screaming in battle, deeper but still undeniably feminine. Most importantly, the fluctuation her mere words caused reminded me of the ethereal voice of the King Blood, how it spoke to our souls instead of merely our ears. It drew attention, exuded majesty, made her seem more mature if one disregarded the otherworldly nature of it. Her arms suddenly pulsed, mana snapping down from her shoulder to her fingers. I'm not sure if I feel amazing or if I'm still in pain. You're sensitive. Tom will fix that. My head is cold. Well, I hesitated with a small smile, Amara's hand moving to her scalp, gently touching the short hair that was only just starting to come in. Am I fucking bald? Sorry, babe. It fell off when you shed all your skin. It's growing back nicely, though. My skin shed off? What the fuck happened to me? A lot. But the important thing is that everything went according to plan. You even managed to protect yourself with the invocation for the duration of the transformation. You did good. I gave her hand a squeeze. She gave me a small nod, still feeling her scalp. She had only grown a few centimeters of hair, but she hadn't started growing back hair until about 8 hours ago, when I went to sleep last. She was regrowing it fast, but it still might take a week or two to get short hair. I smiled. I can shave my head so we match. Huh? But your hair is so nice. I don't mind being bald with you. I've been thinking about chopping some of it off anyway. Now's a good time. I pulled up a chair and sat next to the bed. Amara smiled at me, and then her free hand moved to hover over her stomach, brushing it gently. So, children. We can't know. I mean, it's difficult enough to have children as it is, especially as we get more powerful. I already asked Terrace if there are any tests they can do, but he said there aren't any that wouldn't risk false promises. So there really is no way to know. It'll still take 2 months for everything to completely settle in anyway, so we should just wait and see. She nodded, looking sad but otherwise holding it in. Neither of us were optimistic, but we had made peace with what we needed to. It was done. There was no turning back now. At some point, Terrace walked in to do his checkup. He cast some magic and made sure that all was right with Amara's body, that nothing was still injured or healing. Take at least today to rest and do nothing except eat and sleep. Tomorrow you can start walking around, and we can test your sensitivity and magic. We want to make sure everything works properly, including the new organ you have. It's perfectly ready to use, but try to refrain for now. I don't want you to hurt yourself. Yes, sir. Let me know if there is anything you're concerned about. Otherwise, I'll leave you two alone today. You can order whatever you want with the aerial right there. Thank you. We gave our thanks and Terrace left. After that, we had plenty of alone time, talking about idle thoughts and getting some food. Amara was starved, and if I smelled food, I knew I'd want some too. The rest of the day was spent like that. Amara couldn't do much of anything, so instead I humored her and spoke of earthly things. She had thought of more questions since I told her I was from a different world. It was mainly about my life, or the context surrounding my life. I spoke of school, from elementary to university, the various fields of education, what I studied, and where I had gotten most of my knowledge from. I spoke of the more complicated but widespread technology like the internet, social media, television, radio, satellites, telescopes, and more. Computers were still a generally foreign concept to her, but since the aerial existed, she was able to wrap her head around simpler functions. It was just that simple things to me like social media and video games were completely alien concepts. She could never truly grasp the scale and depth of what they meant without experiencing it herself, but she loved hearing about it. I was even able to tickle her eyes with some illusions, putting an image to the things I talked about. That day passed, and when the next morning came, Terrace was back to do some physical tests. Amara finally got herself walking, and for a moment, it looked like she needed to relearn how to walk. The amazing thing was that the elements followed her every movement. Her body was now as in tune with mana as she was, and that quickly led to subconscious elemental manipulation. By simply wanting to reach her goal faster, the air would come to cradle her, and when she felt the cold floor with her feet for the first time, fire mana streamed through her soles and into the floor. When she accidentally tripped, the entire atmosphere surged and picked her back up. It was like the entire world was at her command, her magic directly tied to her nervous system. She was almost a completely new being. And one thing that I only noticed after she first stood to her full height was that she had actually grown, putting her right around 6 foot. Those bone marrow injections really put in work. Amara remarked that she'd have to get a new wardrobe, but thankfully the hat still fit, so she had no excuses not to continue wearing it. I got a glare after pointing that out. It was about 6 hours of physical and magical therapy where Terrace went through a checklist to make sure Amara was working fine. The conclusion was that she was more than fine, although the sensitivity would take a little while to die down, no more than a few days. Like me, her senses had been boosted significantly, which meant a lot of her concentration was spent trying not to get overwhelmed by it. She also didn't have the mental capacity I did, so for her it was just a matter of her brain numbing over time. When that was over and night came, I decided to finally shave my head bald. The doctors in the ward obviously had shaving knives, so I got one and even got some help. Before long, my scalp was gleaming. Amara laughed her ass off for over a minute, then sporadically for an hour as she molested my shiny bald head. With all that said and done, there was nothing else for us to do, and so we were free to go. I had already handled any other business I had with the church in advance, so there was no more reason to stay here. I sent messages to a few pertinent people and notified them that we would be leaving. Luna was one of them, and she came to visit in the medical ward. But apparently word travels fast, and the Pope showed up with Anderson as well. Amara was rightfully shocked when one of the most influential people in the entire world showed up at the door. She was dressed in some of my clothes, which meant they were baggy, and she felt self-conscious. Still, the Pope shook her hand after a few greetings. Congratulations, Miss Teleria. It may be difficult at first, but this crown will afford you vast power. I hope you will exercise it to its fullest against the scourge of this world. Yes, sir, I will. Alongside John I will bring forth my greatest potential. So you will. The Pope smiled at her and turned to me. Great men demand great women, but by consequence they too make great sacrifices. Treat her well, John Cooper, and place her within your right mind. She is one who will bear you in ways no other person will. So forever spare her from your pride. Thus is my intention. I answered him plainly, not enjoying his scrutinizing gaze. It wasn't malicious, but it felt like he was seeing things I didn't want him to see, and I didn't need someone reiterating something I had already decided for myself. The Pope nodded, and our conversation came to a close. After he and Luna left with Anderson, who remained quietly smiling in the corner of the room the whole time, Willow and Ignatius came by. We held a small conversation with them before deciding it was about time to go. I gathered all of Amara's things, and we took my helicopter back to the city of Joffrin, taking several hours to do so. By now everyone had left the wedded city, and I heard that the military was starting to get tabs on the survivors from the treehouse. When we landed in Telexia's backyard, she naturally wanted to see us. Faye also came running out, and both of them froze in their tracks when they saw us. Telexia narrowed her eyes. Why are you two bald? It's the new trend these days. You haven't heard? Apparently not. Yeah, everyone under 30 years old is supposed to shave their heads. Hey Faye, let's bring you into the fold. I waved at the teenage girl, who quickly shook her head. No, I'm okay. Come on, it'll be quick and mostly painless. No, get over here. Ah. She squealed when I dove over and threw her over my shoulder, running into the house as she called out for her mother. Telexia ignored us, her and Amara following behind, but ultimately heading somewhere else to talk. I body slammed Faye onto a large couch. It was about 3 years after I'd first met her, and now she was 17, into her first year at the magisterium. As expected, she was a knight, but with the temperings I'd gone through I was actually stronger despite her being authority 3. Not to mention that when she finally started wrestling back against me, I was able to engage my knowledge and expertly handle her into a lock. She ended up in a triangle choke, completely at my mercy, the two of us face to face. She struggled a bit, even used vigor to try and brute force her way out, but it didn't matter. She eventually gave up, and I smiled. So how are you? Choking. Heh. Before you pass out, tell me what you think of this. I took out a small box, opening it and revealing a ring. Faye's eyes widened. The ring was made of the purest gold that Rupert's gems could get their hands on and studded with enchanted diamonds that made them swirl with colorful mana. It wasn't reinforced or inlaid with powerful crystals because it was supposed to be a symbol. I had forsaken the expensive things to get something relatively simple. It didn't even have magical functions besides the aesthetic enchantment. I'm going to marry your sister, and wanted to make sure I got your approval first. I undid the lock, Faye laying against me as I let her scan the ring. Do you feel all right with that? To be honest, I half expected you two to come back already wed. Mom was talking about you guys basically getting married with your trip. That's probably because your mother considers the gift I gave Amara to be a dower. Many millions of coin were spent and favors were exchanged, but what I gave your sister isn't something that can be bought. No matter what though, I want to make sure that you're okay with this. I want your blessing as well as your parents. I'm obviously not going to say no. I don't know that. That's why I'm asking, because believe it or not, it's important to me that my sister-in-law doesn't hate my guts. I went and tickled her half teasingly, making her jerk around and laugh. I obviously knew her answer, but what mattered to her was posing the question at all. If Amara was any indication, these girls had never considered that their opinion mattered regarding relationships, even if they wanted it to. It meant something that I was coming to her for approval. After talking a bit longer about that, the two of us talked about her time at the magisterium. It seemed like she was doing well there, although I loathed the idea of her being a student under Carrion. I had been there only a few years ago, Even though it now felt like a lifetime ago, I internally decided that I'd just need to make sure I kept an eye on her, especially once they started going on expeditions and visiting bases. God forbid she goes through anything similar to what Amara and I did. The way things were going, she wouldn't even get the chance to run. I messed around with her a bit more before deciding that Amara and her mother were taking too long, so Faye and I decided to leave the house. It was a bit after noon, so I decided a lunch date was in order, the two of us heading to a nice restaurant and getting some chow. It was only after we had eaten and wandered the city a bit that I finally got scolding messages from Telexia and had to go home. Once there, Telexia called me to her study where she and Amara were. I had Faye go off and do her own thing while I went. Inside the study, Telexia held some papers behind her desk, and I sat beside Amara. Guns showed up, gave everyone leave. They all went back to their families for a time as the military regroups. The numbers also came out for survivors. Many different groups were found, but in total we've recovered 8,000 survivors. Most of them are higher combatants, the ones who could actually run. Telexia handed me one of the papers, and I absorbed all the information with a glimpse. As expected, the defeat was almost absolute. Everyone had retreated not long after the generals ran away, and naturally those who could escape were those with the power to run. Even then, it was pure luck that they could make it out. 4% survival rate. Fucking atrocious. So, were you given any plans for mustering another stronghold? Not yet, but some say that they want to construct another base just outside the river, to the west before the mountain range that led to Stronghold Charlie. No plans have been made though. Since the Scourge isn't pushing farther, they're waiting. Well, it gives me time to do my thing. I was going to ask, but what plans did you have in mind? I set the paper down and leaned back. I plan on creating a new army. I want to build it from the ground up, induct soldiers and train them my way to fight a different kind of war. But to do that I need metal, and to that end I'll be working with San. 2 months should be enough to build my foundation, but your help would be appreciated. What kind of help? I'll need soldiers, lots of them. I also want to be placed at whatever new base gets founded. Polly and Jasmine need to come with me, and I'll be speaking with Guns about acquiring operators from him. That man is difficult to negotiate with. He won't just give you the best soldiers in the kingdom. He will after he sees what I have in store. But again, I need to build it first. That's why I'll be bouncing around for a while. I'd like Amara with me as I do that. She needs time to acclimate to her crown, and I have things to teach her. Telexia nodded, glancing at Amara. Guns only gave them 2 weeks before he wants them to report to Stronghold Beta. Don't care. They'll bend for me, or I'll leave them to hang. I have a feeling they know exactly how valuable I am now, so if they have any wrinkles on their brain, then they'll shut their holes. If they don't, then just tell them to come find me. See if they can. Telexia hummed, not denying my words. Silence reigned for a few moments. Telexia sifting through papers idly until I chimed. What's your plan? I'm just worrying about keeping you two safe. It feels like things are out of my hands. Then put your hands back in. Speaking so simply hardly eases the difficulty. Well, there's going to be an opportunity. Let's just say, you're still a powerful warlock and I'd love to have a marshal among the forces around me, one I can trust. That way I can support you too. Of course, you'd be back in the field, but I think it would be a good change of pace. We'll see. Get your affairs in order first. If you need any help, you know where to find me. Sure. I stood from my seat, the two ladies mirroring me. I gave Telexia a hug. I'll be leaving tonight for the capital so I can grab San. After that, I'm going to disappear for a while. There are rumors of the king holding an assembly soon. High military officials and nobles will be in attendance to discuss our next courses of action. It wouldn't be for another few months or so, but you should make sure to keep an eye out for letters. If you or San aren't invited, then I'll bring you under my name. Either way, you should attend. Sure. We separated with those words. The rest of the day passed leisurely. Amara got teased for her bald head by Faye. Ikor was off on business apparently, and after the night ended with dinner, Amara and I decided to fly ourselves to the capital. We didn't land at my house though. That was too easy of a spot for the third claw to get to me. Instead, I landed on top of the Black Spider Hotel, which was now fitted with a large platform holding 8 helipads and a lobby. I took one of the open pads and walked into the rooftop lobby with Amara, who wore her witch hat. The keymaster was behind a desk there and smiling happily. Good evening, John. Good evening, Madame Teleria. It is good to see you two back. It's good to be back, Keymaster. Is my room still collecting dust? It is tidier than you left it. Would you like me to prepare any room service? No, thank you. We'd like a quiet night until we leave in the morning. Understood. Now, how would you like me to deal with the unsavory individuals watching you fly in? I glanced to the side. I had also seen the unique or disrupting cloaks of the third claw on my way in. But there was no way they could definitively tell it was me. I waved. Fuck those guys. They aren't worth your trouble, and they can do nothing to me anymore. The second they exposed themselves to my knowledge is the second that they lost any advantages they had against me. The Keymaster smiled wide, almost maliciously. Indeed. You are an exceptional man, John Cooper. Please, enjoy your stay at the Black Spider Hotel. I will. You enjoy your night, Keymaster. Amara bowed after we exchanged goodbyes, the two of us stepping away and going to my room. Once there, I threw off my coat and settled onto the familiar couch in front of the window wall. Amara sat beside me as I sighed. Who's the third claw? They are the kingdom's counter-espionage group, a secret department of soldiers working directly for the royal family. When I arrived back in the capital after visiting you at Stronghold Beta, the third claw captured and interrogated me thinking I had fed the church my designs for planes. They got nothing out of me after a bit of torture, and they dumped me back on the street after leaving behind some threats. They forced me to dissociate with the black markets and promised never to enter them again, the hotel included. Then I had to pay taxes. They dared. I know. To think I had to pay taxes. No, that's not what I chuckled a bit, Amara letting out an exasperated grunt. You know what I mean. Why didn't you tell me about this earlier? It wasn't pertinent at the time, and both of us had enough to worry about. But I'm telling you now, because there's something else I need to inform you of. What's that? While we were at the church getting the crown situation sorted, I handed the Pope my designs. And I mean just about all of them. The elemental crystals, the mana engine, the planes, everything. She gawked at me, staring in disbelief as I smiled. Why would you do that? The kingdom will brand you a traitor. If they find out, yes, they will. But at this point I could care less. The church having my designs will massively boost their combat power. Amara, they have an entire war front that nobody knows about, and they're doing more damage to the Scourge than the kingdom is. I gave the designs to them so humanity has a better fighting chance, but I also got promises that they won't expose them to the kingdom either. For now I'm safe, but even if they discover it, they have no power over me. I could just leave for the church at any time. Nobody can pin me down. We could leave. She reiterated, my smile widening. We would leave for the church. You don't get to leave me behind. Indeed. That was poor wording on my part. I pulled her closer. If I become a traitor, then you'll have to be a traitor with me. You're my accomplice now since I've told you my evil plan. Oh, you're the villain now? I can't believe I'm dating a bad guy. Good thing you're rich. You mean you didn't like me for my smoldering good looks? The only thing smoldering are those cigars of yours. Ah, I see. Baldy. Shut up. Not fair. Ah, don't turn your head. The moonlight bouncing off of it blinds me. I'll just blind you with my fingers then. Ah. She tackled me, and we started to wrestle, so I threw in some tickles to keep her on her toes. We did that until we both got tired. By that time it was really late, and both of us were tangled together, things having gotten a little warm. I didn't push further though. I had a feeling that Amara was still sensitive about things, so I decided to give it a while before I took any opportunities to get dirty. So we ended our night, my head still filled with the list of things I needed to do tomorrow. Things were about to get busy. Chapter 243, Revolution. January 9th, 626. Amara and I landed in Wonderland. San was already there to meet us, and we got right down to business. He was ready to cooperate fully with my redesign of company operations. It would cost him a massive amount of money, but in the long run it would make him one of the most powerful people in the world. He would be the leader of what could be considered the upcoming industrial economy as a whole, and the fate of humanity's military would be in his hands. Of course, not entirely. I was here, and nothing was out of my hands if I didn't want it to be. The first thing I had him do was cease manufacturing nearly across the board. It was all hands on deck for this change, and not a single sector of the company was going to remain untouched. After that, I went to the lab and started modifying and adding designs on the spot. I had spent many hours thinking about them, and I already knew what I was going to put down to the rune. So using orbs, I quickly put out all of the designs that would revolutionize production as a whole. assembly lines and automation for the manufacturing plants, tools and massive excavation machines for mining, entire building designs for advanced forges and material processing plants, safety equipment for workers, oversight equipment and programs for managers. Singular units of these tools and structures would match or increase output across the board. The mining tools would increase input from hundreds of tons or a year to millions of tons a year if scaled correctly. The processing plants would consume all the input and spit out metals and materials at a rate these people couldn't conceive of and with efficiencies they didn't yet understand. The assembly lines would increase vehicle production from 1 or 2 a day to dozens a day. Planes, tanks and vehicles, ordnance, and weapons would flood from our plants and fill entire armies with their bulk. The goal was to produce them faster than the scourge could kill them. Magic would make this all too easy. Under normal circumstances, I would be delusional to think that I could restructure a company from top to bottom, revamp entire industries, and have their workers adapt fast enough to produce at the scale I wanted. On Earth, it would take decades to do something like that. Here, it was just a matter of making the magic. Everything was so low maintenance that you only had to teach people how to use the tools rather than how to maintain them. There were no engines to fail, no engineering to tamper with. Magic reinforcement meant that even wear and tear was just about null. Warlocks could move tons of earth by themselves in a mine, and getting tools to do it with similar magic would simply multiply their output. The miners needed buckets and diggers, the forges needed more buckets and heat, and the fabrication plants needed precision tools to move away from handcrafting and toward mass production. I already knew about all the steps a civilization would have to take in order to reach that level. With magic, I could skip most of it and jump straight into the good stuff. Welding? Magic had that covered. Shaping hot metals? Go grab an earth warlock. Moving 10,000 pounds of cold steel to a truck for hauling? Ricky over there was an authority 6-night. Give him a few minutes. 2. Fucking easy. It was so easy that it was criminal that this world hadn't already reached this point. I knew that normal development was a thing, but I saw no reason why the kingdom couldn't have scaled itself to the modern era yet. Earth's humanity had moved from wood and paper aircraft to landing on the moon in 66 years. People in this world could live for hundreds of years, and they were just barely inventing primitive radios. Maybe I had just come at the perfect time, but these people should be exploring the stars by now. In fact, I saw no reason that in my lifetime here, I wouldn't be able to go to their moon myself. One thing at a time. I put down the full designs for everything in my vision, using a tank as an example. I knew about everything that went into the production of a full tank from start to finish, so I detailed those processes and then created new tools to make those processes better. For me, it was straightforward. Most of the tools were super simple, just bigger or better versions of what they already had, especially in the case of mining. But things like the assembly line weren't so. Building them and getting them started would be the difficult part. After the initial learning curve, we'd be flying high. During my first day at Wonderland, I got every design and enchantment down, as well as every guide and manual I could think of in regard to these tools and their creation and usage. With orbs, it was easy for me to write entire books in minutes and lay down enchantments in seconds. After the first day, with everything on the table and the plan in my head, San and I went to work. All production on normal items, including aircraft, aerials, and all other enchanted items, came to a screeching halt, and all efforts were redirected. San had already bought a mining company that owned a few mines, among them an iron mine, so we first had our productive capacity dedicated to building the mining equipment from my designs. San also acquired a material processing company, so we went and laid the groundwork for a total restructuring of one of their buildings, turning it into a steel plant. It would take some time to tear everything down and rebuild it back up, but we had nothing if not money to get it done. Finally, we started the process of restructuring all of our own manufacturing warehouses and facilities within San Industries. San had already started following my instructions when I handed them to him upon my return, so they were ready to get revamped. They were the places where we'd be laying down assembly lines, and I had an assembly line designed for almost every single product San Industries produced. One for small enchanted items like aerials and mana engines, one for vehicles like tanks and cars, one for planes, and even facilities for things that took hands like elemental crystals. It was only unfortunate that we couldn't secure our own supply of white crystals. Many days passed. The process of just laying the groundwork for each level of industry took a full week. San was often working in the Spire getting his facilities there restructured, and I was working in places like our massive warehouses outside the capital, the mines, and Wonderland. Amara was with me the whole time, following around, most often quietly, and just watching or helping if she could. More importantly, she was learning about the business. I wanted to get her into enchanting, and this was the first step toward that. After the first week, people started getting organized, and the project, which seemed like it wasn't moving at all, started showing notable progress. Facilities were getting built, machines were fielded, and on-the-fly training was starting. The bigger assembly plants, where everything had been torn down, started getting built back up. The second week was spent doing just that, with me almost constantly flying around while on my aerial, constantly answering questions, constantly correcting mistakes, constantly pushing progress. Thankfully, San had trained his summoners and warlocks well. They may not be familiar with the technology, but they knew how to follow directions and build things according to specifications. They didn't have to understand why a machine was built the way it was. They just had to build it correctly. Because of that, I wasn't spending my time correcting manufacturing defects and was spending most of it simply teaching people how it would be used. That was what filled my third and fourth weeks. I taught the miners how to use their new tools, which basically consisted of telling them how to scoop and dig with bigger buckets and bigger pickaxes. One thing I didn't need to teach was how to carry out explosive mining, which they already knew how to do. With magic, creating explosions to blast away a bunch of rock was simplicity itself and already ingrained in every warlock. They did that shit for fun. The material processing facilities were the most difficult. After getting barebones logistics sorted, I had to teach them how to operate machines built into entire buildings. Things like operating massive crucibles, making sure you didn't pour molten iron all over your friends, how to handle and shape tons and tons of red-hot steel with huge machines built for that very purpose. Thankfully, it wasn't too dangerous for them. With my built-in safety measures and the inherent resilience of knights and defensive spells of warlocks, I didn't have to worry too much about mistakes, especially since they were only handling base materials, not yet reinforced or enchanted. Sure, a knight could still get crushed under the weight of 60,000 pounds of iron, but if powerful enough, they could actually survive falling into a crucible full of molten metal so long as it wasn't enhanced by magic. Stupid knights. I just had to make sure that they were processing materials at all. To do that, they had to be taught things, and thankfully summoners learned quickly. I could teach them all at once and then just delegate the management positions to them. They would make sure everything ran how it should. The last thing was the assembly lines, and that was more straightforward than material processing. It was simply following the steps. Metals would be shaped into the plates and pieces the assemblers needed to put together, and then one by one each person would handle a single repetitive job. It was almost brainless, and it was what made it such a good system. One person didn't have to know the entire design by heart. One person only needed to know the part they were responsible for. One warlock would handle the singular job of welding two certain pieces together perpetually. They would only receive those two pieces, would only weld those two pieces together, would only hand off that final product. They would do it hundreds of times in a day. It would be mind-numbing, but it would be easy. You could still fuck it up, but the chances of that happening were far lower than in any other system, and it was easy to spot and correct. Getting it set up was the hard part, but even that wasn't difficult with the power of eager summoners desperate for good pay. San Industries was renowned, a prestigious company that invented and manufactured flight. Everyone wanted to work there because the company was rich and famous. They paid and treated their workers well, and now they were restructuring. There were thousands of new hires, but all of them were motivated to perform their best and make bank. And when I showed up personally to make sure things got done right, John Cooper was famous and only second to San himself in company authority. He was a genius summoner, a powerful summoner who survived fighting on the front lines. Nobody would dare disappoint him. Nobody would dare do things any way but his. Being famous had its perks, like that the first month of Revolution passed. The machines were built, the workers were roughly taught, the buildings were expanded and filled. Not everything had been built, but that was what the second month was for. Moving into it, all the problems that cropped up due to operation were stamped out. Again, it was nonstop movement for me going from one place to another, trying to sort out all the problems that demanded my attention. Thankfully, it was always solved about instantly. I knew everything in and out, and the power of my mind made me obscenely efficient. When a problem was posed, I could think of everything that could cause it, and then rapidly narrow it down when I either received more information about it or looked at it myself. I could handle 24 things at once with this mind. I couldn't conceive of doing what I did before advancing to Authority 7, but here I was doing it. I was unstoppable. I provided all the answers. No amount of kinks in the operation could put a stop to my progress. Everything was in my hands. After the new gears in my industry were put into place, I started to worry more about logistics. Not everything could be flown everywhere, so I slated roads to be built that our own cars and trucks would use to transport materials and products from one place to another. Testing grounds for newly built vehicles and tools were set aside, and distribution centers were placed in a few key cities. Our products would be coveted everywhere, so we made sure they could reach every corner of the kingdom. 2 weeks passed into the second month, and it seemed like everything was coming together just as I envisioned. With the facilities built, they could start pumping out materials and products, and through that, they would sort themselves out. If there were any problems, running the production line would expose them, and if it couldn't be solved by the managers, I was there with the answer. After all, I was too smart to create defects in my designs. I made things as idiot-proof as I could and gave them wide tolerances. There was always bound to be a problem, but my genius is what allowed me to carry out this revolution in the first place. During that 6th week of revolution, though, I finally got the expected letter. I was personally invited to the King's Assembly, an assembly to determine the course of action for the future of the military and the fight against the scourge. All high and mid-level nobles were invited, as well as almost every general, marshal, and sovereign. I was invited not as a noble or soldier, but as a renowned enchanter of military application. The assembly would take place at the royal palace on March 1st, giving me 2 weeks to prepare. I thought about how I would approach this meeting. Part of me wanted to stay out of trouble and let things continue the way they were. The other part wanted to flip everything upside down and shatter the status quo. I decided that the compromise would be getting what I wanted. I wanted a metal army, and I had a feeling that this would be the perfect time to set that up. There would be plenty of people there with the pull I needed to get what I wanted. I just needed enticement, which I possessed in explosive amounts. Since Son had also received a letter, I had him begin planning for the event. We decided to treat it as another showcase, because what better place to advertise our new weapons than a room full of generals talking about war? Of course, we needed to make sure to have some for demonstration, but we were already beginning to churn out operational tanks and armored vehicles for testing. We could easily set some aside and drive them into the capital. It would be a fun little excursion. I'd especially like to see the Third Claw try something this time. If they decided to try and kidnap me again, I'd have to conduct an experiment to see how well the human body fared against a 120mm high-explosive shell. Chapter 244, Pompous. February 27th, 626. I tuned out Amara's soft snores, staring at the screen in front of me containing lines of code. I hadn't been much of a programmer on Earth, though I had dabbled in it, learned a language or two. Unfortunately, only the backbone knowledge of that subject was applicable for me here. Son was a genius. Before the aerial, when an enchanter put down an enchantment, the enchantment instructions were fixed and permanent. They never went beyond what the enchantment did, like building a purpose-driven machine. It had clear limits and did nothing beyond what it was intended to do. But Son created both hardware that could change and the software to take advantage of it. Being able to program demanded that data storage could change itself, reading and writing and running code. So, Son had to make an enchantment that could not just store data like an orb, but change itself. More than that, it had to be able to change itself without demanding a full re-enchantment from a warlock. It had to be an enchantment that could enchant its own enchantment. This was the most important concept behind Son's aerial system. He had made the first magical computer and all the systems within it, almost entirely from scratch. He was a genius, and I appreciated that. What I did not appreciate was having to revamp a poorly written assembly language in order to work with Son's tech. The aerials worked on their own specially designed ecosystem and operating system, with their own language to boot. The language was primarily derived from the enchanting language, which was understandable, but it didn't have to be. It seems like Son realized that fact halfway through and made a language that was a mix between raw enchanting and his own invented assembly. It was ridiculous that he managed to make anything work, and so I set off to make a new language that could replace his, one that was far easier to work with. The great thing about it all was the fact that the most raw language that the Ariel spoke wasn't ones and zeros. It was the esoteric language of mana and psyche, and technically, all I had to do was translate it into something a bit more comprehensible. San had already done half the work, so I did the other half and made it all cohesive. As for determining the processing power of an Ariel or anything like that, I was stumped. For now, I didn't care, and it seemed like the Ariel could process anything I threw at it instantly. I had yet to reach its limits, mainly because I hadn't yet programmed anything that could possibly force it to struggle. Either way, I had developed my own programming language, gave the documentation to San, and started implementing a certain level of programming with all the things we were making. In order to make any system inside of a tank, plane, vehicle, or weapon automated in any form, it needed to have some level of programming, which I was perfectly fine with implementing. Because of the gearing systems I designed, I made it so that tanks could operate in both autoloader mode and manual mode. Knights could throw in shells easily, and if they weren't there, then the tank driver could have the autoloader do the lifting, just slower than a knight could. Unfortunately, I didn't have access to spatial enchantments that could modify spatial storages and codify extraction. If I did, I could make it so that a spatial device would automatically deposit a new shell into the chamber when one was fired. With enough engineering, it would allow a tank to fire multiple times a second instead of after multiple seconds. I had to manage expectations for now. Anything programmed for vehicles was inserted after the construction process was finished. Since I had hand-designed the code, all the builders needed to do was copy the applicable code onto whatever device was needed and insert it. I didn't have to worry about teaching the programming language, although there were summoners in Wonderland handling that task. Fortunately, everything that I made simply worked. I was too smart to make mistakes, especially with my attention to detail. Preparations for the King's Assembly were underway and coming along swimmingly. We had our largest tank design fully operational, which was the one we were going to showcase. We also had all of our armored vehicles ready, including superior steeds, proper APCs, armored cars, and regular cars. We also had new plane designs out, though those weren't as much of a priority and wouldn't be showcased. We did have artillery out, though, as well as missile systems for aircraft and improved turrets. Not everything would be on display, but San and I were ready for shock and awe. On this particular day, I just had to shape up a few more programs before pushing them for use. One's for sensor systems that we wanted to install on planes. Of course, I had been working all night in my office. My sleep schedule had recently come down to whenever I could, so it was morning, and I'd be going to sleep after this was finished. Amara should be waking up later. She had been doing nothing but practicing magic when I wasn't occasionally teaching her about enchanting or running around with her in tow. But as I put down words, I suddenly sensed some new auras come into the outer office. I ignored it and continued, but then they got close to my door, and I sensed Boris move to block them. The emotions got agitated. There were two people, and I wondered who was ballsy enough to come demanding things in my own fucking office. I pat Amara's head, and she instantly woke up. What happened? Someone's here. You can go back to sleep. No, it's fine. She sighed and got up, rubbing her eyes as I stood to open the door. As soon as it cracked, I heard conversing. Thankfully, no arguments. One of the people was talking in an overly formal dialect. For months. If he's here, we implore you to allow us a word. Sir. Boris ignored the man and turned when I opened the door. I looked at the newcomers, my patience thinned since I was tired. I turned to the obvious man in charge, dressed in a fine suit and obviously rich. Even the butler looked rich, distinguished. Who the fuck are you? Sir Cooper. The man stuck out his gloved hand, smiling widely. You can call me Vatsy. I've been fighting to meet you for some time. You seem to be a very busy man. Figure that out all by yourself? I didn't even glance at his hand, instead frowning at his accent, making a guess. It was masked by this world's language, but it was still distinct. What do you want? I have a proposition. He retrieved his hand and continued smiling. I was hoping we could discuss a form of partnership. What form? More political than financial, since I'm sure you have all the money you could dream of in this world. It may only make you a king over primitives, but that's better than being poor on earth, is it not? I stared at him for a moment before sighing and waving. Come in. We walked back into my office, Amara nudging me with her aura and speaking telepathically. Another person from your home? From my planet, yes. Is that a good thing? Let's just say it guarantees nothing. I sat down in my chair, Amara sitting beside me in her own, leaving Vatsy and his butler to stand. Boris closed the door behind us, waiting outside. I sighed again. So what do you want? The Crown intends to impose regulation on your aircraft, planes and helicopters both, as well as airfields and their management. They want control, and I happen to know people in their primitive instance of a parliament. I can make sure that the regulations don't come down too hard. After all, I wouldn't want you to be hindered in your attempt to move this blasted planet forward a few centuries. I quite loathe having to take a wagon everywhere there isn't a teleporter. Here's my problem with that, Brit. He frowned at my remark while I forced down my drowsiness with my psycha. I'm actually quite fine with the Crown imposing restrictions. All it does is hurt them, nothing more than shooting themselves in the foot. But it would cost you millions of coin, completely eliminating a whole section of your business. And yet I don't care. My face remained placid. The kingdom was being idiotic. No surprises there. But now, I didn't have much of an issue with that. If they wanted to disadvantage themselves, then I would let them, because now, I at least knew that no matter what they did, humanity as a whole would be perfectly fine. I had sent my newest designs produced during my little revolution to the church. They had everything, and just as I would arm my own army, so too would they arm theirs. Except they would gear up on a much larger scale than I could, with more power behind their industry, and without the stupidity to boot. It could be said that by allowing the kingdom to degrade their own power, I was preparing for the future. Besides, even if they imposed regulation on the aircraft, the tanks and armor that I was already rolling out would remain unaffected. We had already made plenty of planes, so those wouldn't be lacking. And as for the bombs, those were produced in Wonderland, securely stockpiled, and only distributed to specific clients according to their needs. The kingdom was only one of those clients, and once I had my army, I wouldn't need to go through them to get my hands on ordnance. I was the source. I was the creator and producer. The kingdom might have the recipe for themselves, but we had the industry. They could produce as much as they wanted for themselves. It wouldn't stop us from producing dozens of times more. Not to mention, San was so filthy rich that we could buy all the crystals we wanted from the church, completely bypassing the kingdom if we wanted to. I had already set up distribution points in the Holy See and within Wonderland, one of the things I had asked the Pope for. The kingdom couldn't stop us because they knew absolutely nothing about our supply line, nor anything else going on in Wonderland. I had hard control over everything I needed to be concerned about. I had a supply of crystals, and we had bought and developed our own chain of material acquisition and processing. I owned the entire industry top to bottom, and I'd never make the mistake of allowing the kingdom to steal something from me, nor allowing them the opportunity to threaten me again. Their greatest mistake was allowing me to ever leave that room. I sighed and zoned back in on Vatsy. So, anything else? Is there a reason you believe yourself to be so immune to their machinations? Do you not realize how deep the kingdom hides its secrets? If you're talking to me about the dark corners of the kingdom, then you're even more naive about what's going on than I thought. If that was your only proposal, then you can see yourself out. I don't need political help. Hang on. He put up his hand right as Boris opened the door. Seeing as the conversation wasn't done, Boris shut it once more. I know you understand that, like you. I'm from Earth as well, John Cooper. Yeah? And does that hold no weight with you? We must cooperate. There are few of us, and this world is out to kill us. If we don't pool our resources and powers, we'll fade away, and our superiority will die with us. See, now I have a problem with you. I took out a cigar, lighting it while staring at Vatsy. I spoke after taking a few puffs, handing it to Amara so she could do the same. How long have you been here, Vatsy? I came to this world around 8 years ago. 8 years. Around 4 years before I arrived. And yet, what do you have to show for it? Money? An auction house. I sense nothing greater than authority 9 power from you, and yet you dare call yourself superior. My talent is far from being spent. You could not possibly expect me to reach authority 10 or break the Great Barrier in such a small amount of time. I'm already considered a genius as it is. And yet there are plenty of natives in this world who have outperformed you. You derive superiority from a bit of money and some shack in a black market? I consider what you've done as downright pathetic, especially since you've had double the time on this planet as I have. I stood, walking up to him and sticking my finger against his chest, several inches below mine. I have more money than you. I've built planes using this world's magic. I'm about to roll out new machines of war. I've been on the front lines, and I've killed more monsters than you can count. I've revolutionized this world, and I'm just getting started. Yet the only reason I know who you are is because I've been to a couple of your parties. I'm a fucking legend, and you're just some obscure figure in a black market playing the pompous Englishman. You've done fuck all. I jabbed my finger against him with every enunciation, feeling my anger rise. So don't come here expecting to ride my coattails just because we come from the same rock. And don't you dare ever call yourself superior to anything but a steaming pile of dog shit again. You're a coward with misplaced priorities, focusing on playing politics and hoarding money instead of using your talent to solve the real problem. I could have come to this world full of Earth's technology and springboard from there, but instead I find it a rotting swamp. Now I'm left to fix it myself, all because a sorry excuse of a man, a fucking Brit, couldn't muster the balls to be anything more than a fucking waste of oxygen. I felt a pistol appear in my hand, so I pressed it against his head, feeling the fear in his aura despite his face remaining frozen. Unless you have something valuable to bring to this world, don't ever show your face to me again. Otherwise, I might just kill you and wield your assets myself. Perhaps then your life would be of some value. I continued looking into his shaking eyes a bit longer before sensing his butler get angry. I glanced at the older man before pulling away my gun and turning to walk back to my chair. Take your dog and leave. I have nothing more to say to you. He stood there for a few more seconds before leaving silently. Boris peeked inside the open door before closing it once more, leaving Amara and I alone. Amara watched John walk over to his chair and stand beside it. He seemed calm, even though he sounded angry when talking with Fatsy. She hadn't expected him to treat the man like that, but she could understand. Still, she felt something when he got close. He set his hand gently on the back of his chair. The movement was smooth. There was no hidden thought behind it, no hesitation, no emotion. He simply set his hand down. Perhaps that's why she felt something off about it. The lack of emotion, the lack of anger, frustration, sadness, happiness, despair. All the common emotions that she could see in everyone else, that everyone had at least a little of. There was none of it. Maybe that's why she felt scared, why she had to stop herself from flinching when he grabbed the chair and slammed it across his desk full of screens and esoteric devices. Fuck, he screamed, his rage overflowing all at once, previously perfectly withdrawn as if he truly were perfectly fine. He was so good at hiding it. Fuck this goddamned rock. Fuck these worthless fucking idiots. Can't do anything better than serve as scourge fodder. Her eyes flickered as he threw the chair against the wall. It was a steel chair with reinforcement enchantments, and yet he left finger impressions in it. Her eyes snapped toward him, her heart pounding and circulating mana. She knew she wouldn't have to fight her boyfriend, and yet her body was telling her otherwise. She had to force down the effects of her adrenaline, force herself to calm down. She felt a bit of sweat bead on her forehead. She had seen what this man was capable of. She was confident that she had nothing to worry about. But volatility was scary, especially when you couldn't see it coming. She opened her mouth and almost choked, forcing herself to take a breath and prepare her words, lest she show her fear. John. Sorry. He simmered down almost instantly, but something about that pissed her off. She frowned. Was that really necessary? He came to help. He came to leech. It was a transaction, like many others. You could use political help, and you know that. I don't need it. As I said, they'll only be hurting themselves. Unless they institute restrictions that you'll inevitably break, then you'll only give them the excuses that they need to bring down the hammer. I know how this works, John. Probably more than you. She walked up to him, enough adrenaline pumping through her system to make her think she was about to face an authority 10. She reached out and grabbed his chin, moving his head so he was looking straight at her. You're burning bridges before they can even form. I know you're mad at their incompetence, but kicking them to the side when they try to help is how you make enemies. And we've got enough as it is. If Fatsy has any brain, he'll help me anyway. If he doesn't, then he'll only confirm that he's too stupid for me to even consider him as an ally. And if he stands against me out of spite, then I'll kill him and take him for what he's worth. And how much damage would be done in the process? By that time, you'd probably be forced to retreat to the church lest the kingdom hunt you as a traitor. You know what the correct answer here is. You're just too pissed to be diplomatic. No fucking shit, Amara. She forced herself not to recoil at another surge in rage, not to react to the deep-seated madness that peeked out from within his aura. It was something she had never seen in him before, something she had only glimpsed in the psychos of the black markets, something that royals on the battlefield were filled with. His voice fell low. Finally, she could see his depths. It was ugly. It was hateful. I'm sick and tired of it. I'm sick and fucking tired of sheer fucking stupidity getting in my way. If I only had to deal with the natives of this world, then I would understand the scourge still being a problem. But now I find out that there are more people from Earth, and not only have they refused to do anything with their talent, but they've been hiding away with knowledge that will make the scourge a fucking cakewalk to exterminate. It's all being left to me to fucking fix. I'm the one who has to take all the fucking risk. I'm the one who has to lose my friends. All because they couldn't use their fucking brains. The scourge shouldn't be a fucking problem, and yet their idiocy has killed millions. Amara held her ground, even though she could feel his aura spread through the room so thickly that it stung her own, forcing her to pull it back into her body. Even after her crown, his still remained wholly superior. She didn't know how powerful he had become in the past month or so. What she did know was that he was too smart to reason with. He had all the answers. He knew every path. She couldn't fathom his intellect nor the depths of his schemes. There was no reasoning with him because he had already reasoned everything. No, there were only two ways to change his course. The first was by arguing his principles, which was nearly just as impossible. The other way was by taking the issue out of his hands. Amara settled on her solution as he leaned forward. Perhaps he sensed her come to her conclusion. No, she knew he had sensed her. He was the master of the mind. There was little hiding from him. She could feel his rage-filled breath brush her face. Give me a good reason why I shouldn't just kill him and wield his assets for myself. Give me a good reason why I shouldn't just kill those who get in my way and take the tools I need to win this war. Where would it end? Her eyes became firm, staring right back into those golden irises. Are you going to kill everyone? When others come to face you because you killed someone connected to them, are you going to kill them too? Why don't you just go and start a rebellion? It seems to be the most fitting course of action for your logic. He was silent. She knew he had thought it out. He had thought out everything he'd need to do should he actually go through with killing Vatsy. He knew the repercussions, and he knew how he'd need to deal with them. He had pondered overthrowing the king. She knew he had. He knew the steps he'd have to take to become king himself, and if he set his mind to it, she knew he could achieve that. But it wasn't about what he could do. It was about what he wanted. At least right now it was. She pressed. But you don't want to deal with that bullshit. I know it doesn't feel like it, but those people do have some value to bring. They may not be pushing themselves to their greatest potential like you are, but that doesn't mean they're worthless enough to kill. You're just too angry to handle them and play nice. You know the smartest route involves diplomacy, and you know that the greatest value comes from making them willingly work in your favor. Just because you hate politics doesn't mean you don't know it's the right answer to all of this. I don't dash. I'm not fucking finished. She interrupted, feeling so much anger surge up in his aura that for a second, she thought he might bring out a gun and put a bullet through her eye socket. Her voice fell, and she spoke before his rage could build more, lest he block her out entirely. You also have someone who can play politics, who knows how to play the noble game. Someone who's good at putting on a smile and getting what she wants out of people. As your partner, she'll happily wield her skills to help you, to take angering problems off your hands and bring you the beneficial solution. She's not going to let you figure everything out on your own, but she also asks that you come to her for help. Not because you have no other choice, but because she's your most treasured ally, who you trust to handle things as you need them to be handled. From the fourth word, she felt his anger start simmering down. By the end, while he was still pissed, it was no longer overwhelming. It was like he had never considered the fact that she was there to help him. Perhaps he hadn't. With so many things going on that only he could handle, he had forgotten that she was even there. He muttered, as if reluctantly considering, I don't want you to have to play politics. Dear, I'm not forced to go back to that world. If I go back, it'll be because I have something to fight for, which means I'm willing to. You're not asking me to dive into politics. You're asking me to help you. Leave it at that, and let me handle the rest. Fine. Fine what? She smiled, making John sigh. Amara, could you please go to Vatsy and find out what he wants? See if he can be of use to us? Why yes, dear. I would be more than happy to help you in this busy time. Boris. The assistant opened the door, Amara's voice having reverberated through the walls. She smiled at him. Please send someone to catch Vatsy before he leaves. I need to speak with him. Understood. He rushed out, Amara turning back and patting John's cheek before walking off. I'll be back in a short while. You can get some shut-eye until then. Yes, dear. She sauntered out, closing the door behind her. Only then did she finally let out a shuddering breath, her legs feeling weak for a short time as she walked out of the office to go catch the pompous Englishman. Chapter 245 would be wiser. February 27th, 626. Amara took a sip from her cup of tea, rather impressed with the flavor. The butler set down the kettle and stood to the side, ready to serve them should they indicate. She and Vatsy remained silent for a few moments, Amara scrutinizing his aura, even though she had already done so before. Perhaps it was the talent of those who came from Earth, but Vatsy was still impressive despite John's general disgust for his lack of urgency. An Authority 9 warlock after only 8 years of casual work and advancement, having started late in his life since he came from Earth as an adult. He really was a genius by every metric. Even his aura was developed, but not as much as it could be. If John and Aki were any indication, people from Earth had endless potential. John hadn't been able to sense the depths of Aki's aura, and his was greater than Amara's. The fact that Amara could clearly see the bounds of Vatsy's aura meant that, as John said, he really was too lazy. The man spoke and interrupted her thoughts. So, Madame Teleria, can I assume you've come in John's stead? I have. I'd like to start with an apology. John is still on edge. I hope you can understand and forgive, considering what we've recently come back from. She saw Vatsy frown, reluctance filling him. Being called lesser than a steaming pile of dog shit certainly wasn't conducive to healthy relations. But if Vatsy was worth his salt, then he certainly knew what had happened 2 months ago on the front lines. It was an attempt not to earn his sympathy, but force him to bend despite the poor treatment. Besides, it wasn't like Amara disagreed with what John said. She was pissed too. She just found it difficult to show it when John was overflowing with hatred and rage. He had enough for both of them, and she only needed to repair relations enough to get something out of Vatsy, perhaps spare him from John's wrath. She didn't want to see him walk down that road unnecessarily. Vatsy acknowledged Amara's apology with a few moments of silence before moving on. I can assume you will be at the King's Assembly? Yes, as will John. It was described as a meeting to discuss the future of the military's battle against the Scourge, but it is more an opportunity for political change. Nobles from all corners will be swept into this storm, and they all want to ensure the continuity of their lines. This means favors and new laws, especially regarding weapons that can affect the life and death of their growing children in the military. Amara nodded, finally realizing what was going to be happening. Sure, Vatsy wanted a piece of the gargantuan pie known as San Industries, but it wasn't as if he had come without something in exchange. The recent fall of the Treehouse and Stronghold Charlie meant that nobles would have to step up to ensure the Scourge couldn't simply march across the River of Desolation. But of course, they didn't see the Scourge itself as an issue to fix, but an inevitable problem that they had to protect themselves against at the expense of others. When fighting resulted in nothing but losses, they chose to avoid it rather than solve it. The King's Assembly, in a way, had nothing to do with the fight against the Scourge. It was a political battleground, and Vatsy had come to John looking to help protect him and his new industry from the turmoil. It would naturally demand favors from John, but that's what it meant to be political allies. There were no prices in this game, only promises. And you couldn't make promises without the reputation to back them, which John had just shattered in Vatsy's mind. Amara felt her head ache thinking about how she would go about this, but at the same time, she wasn't too worried. She changed the subject once more. You and John are from the same place, yes? Something like that. You could think of us as people from 2 different distant cities. On the planet Earth, right? Vatsy eyed her, Amara resting back into her chair while combing her hair. She was glad that her hair had grown quickly in the last 2 months. It was back to resting between her shoulder blades, just as she liked it, but it was no longer gray. It was sheer white and subtly glowing silver, like the light from the king blood of unholy light. Even her eyebrows and eyelashes were white. She had been jarred when the little strands of hair had come back in and revealed their color, but she had also found that it afforded her the mystique to captivate others when she talked. She was regularly stared at everywhere John brought her. He had described to her the ethereal nature of her voice and presence due to the crown. She decided that it was perfectly suited toward things like this. She smiled. I heard about everything from John. You two are otherworlders, from Earth. He says he's from Texas. Of course he is. But I suppose like in every place, there are divisions between peoples. What is it that he called you? I am from England, of the United Kingdom on the island of Great Britain. That is all you need to know. Amara chuckled. John had shown her a map of his world, educated her on the difference between his United States and other countries. It seemed to be a great source of his pride, to be from America, because unlike her world, Earth was full of different nations. It was like the feud between the church and kingdom, except between nearly 200 different countries. She was no longer surprised that he hadn't cared about making Vatsy angry. He didn't care that they were from the same world. Vatsy was from Europe, which John seemed to regard with some disdain according to his descriptions of the various continents of Earth, though not as much disdain as others. She decided to play dumb. Well, I don't know much about the differences between your allegiances, but I do agree with your previous words. You and John are a scarce breed. There are not many from Earth, and it is good to take care of each other in an unfamiliar world. He doesn't seem to think so. No, he just doesn't care. John Cooper has built himself an empire that, in recent months, has become bigger than anybody realizes. He coins the phrase, too big to fail. Whatever the context, John doesn't need your help. He'll get by just fine because in the end, he's the one in control of the industry. The crown can't take that away from him with any amount of legislation. And perhaps the main reason why he disregarded you in not so nice terms is because you have failed to realize that. Amara's smile never left her face, Vatsy's becoming uglier. I have come here today, Vatsy, because I believe John wasn't entirely correct in his judgment. We do want your help, but the price must be in accord with what you give. You will soon learn of what John Cooper has done to Son Industries, the things he has made, the scale he has expanded to. He plans to treat the upcoming assembly as a showcasing event. This is to say, if you want to help us, you should do so before Son Industries skyrockets in value once more. Take it as a gesture of my goodwill, to warn you of the recent changes. What do you believe my services to be worth? I think you should answer that for yourself. I will not demand anything of you now, and I will give you nothing now. But I believe your help will be valuable. I want to expect it during the assembly. You expect me to help you with nothing to show for it? Do you believe I work for free? Do you want the favor of John Cooper? Amara asked in retort, the smile fading. You said it yourself, Vatsy. You want to be safe. You want protection. You want to know that if the kingdom falls into the gutter, that you'll still have a way out. You don't want to be chained to those you deem lesser. John Cooper is, for all intents and purposes, the sole controller of the behemoth known as Son Industries, perhaps the only entity besides the kingdom and the church as a whole that can guarantee such safety. There's nobody better for protection than they who produce weapons of war. So if you want in, then you'll need to earn our trust, not the other way around. Prove myself to you? Do you not know what I own? Not even John Cooper can know the depth of connections and influence I have through the Polaris market and the royal family. No, he doesn't know. But he also doesn't care, not unless it affects him one way or another. If you stay neutral, then he'll continue on as he has. But if you help him, show him that you really can assist him in a meaningful way, he won't just befriend you, but he'll make sure you can continue to operate as you have. I've seen his generosity. An American being generous? Believe it or not, Vatsy, I speak it to you as it is. It's up to you to decide what side you want to be on before the assembly. Amara stood, barely holding back a roll of the eye. We can discuss more on the day of the assembly, if you wish. You can contact me through my aerial. Amara put out her wrist, Vatsy watching before finally standing and tapping his aerial to hers. Their info was exchanged, Vatsy muttering. What are you to him? You are the daughter of a duchess. Does he intend to marry you? That is the hope. Is there a problem with that? Am I too lowly? I have said those words not because your people are less than human, but because of the knowledge that we possess. If you've been told anything about Earth, then you know that the technology we wield isn't fathomable to you. Our superiority comes from our knowledge of the universe. My knowledge of the most powerful teleportation spells does not make me a sovereign. I would be fatally arrogant to think it does. Vatsy was silent, Amara turning to walk out. Good day, Vatsy. March 1st, 626. I appreciate you, Hans. I know you must be busy. Of course, sir. We would never allow you to present yourself at the king's assembly without suitable wear. Please, Enjoy yourself knowing you'll look among the most majestic. Thank you. I will. I grabbed 3 rings from Hans, walking out of the dark store. The few pairs of suits that I had bought from this place long ago were still nice. But now that I had all the money I could ever want, I decided that I needed to spend a bit more. Even Amara had come here to get herself some dresses, though I haven't seen them yet. I headed back to the hotel, and once I was in my room, I went to the bedroom. Amara was in the bathroom when I announced myself. It seemed she was hiding until she was presentable. I quickly got changed as well. I put one of the rings on my left index finger, and my clothes vanished into it. Then they were replaced by my newest suit, the most pristine and luxurious set of clothing I had ever owned. Amara and I decided to go with a black theme, both because neither of us wanted to wear flashy colors and to symbolize our mourning for the people we lost during the retreat from the treehouse. The suit was a set of black pants and shoes, both of them a matte that drank the light. My top was composed of 4 layers. The shirt was pure black. The vest was black with slightly discernible dark purple trim. The coat was black with individual fine purple threads that traveled in an artistically weaved design across the entire body, only seen with a subtle flash if the light hit it just right. It wrapped my torso tight enough to fit and display my form, but not tight enough to look like a wrap. Then there was an additional overcoat that went down to my shins, also with the same purple accent threads, but additionally interweaved with thin silver metal thread to match Amara. Thankfully, my hair had grown back quickly enough to style it well for this occasion, as did Amara's. I was able to simply comb it back, so there was no need for a hat. I also left a bit of stubble. Amara said she liked it, so I decided not to shave it clean. I looked at myself in the full-body mirror of the room, extremely pleased with how everything came out. I didn't think I could ever look this good, but seeing it now, I supposed it was a matter of course. I was handsome as it was. I could pull off anything. I heard the door click, about to turn around before hearing Wamra. Face the window. I'm not adjusted yet. I turned away with a smile, taking a step to the side, while Amara hurriedly took the mirror. After a handful of seconds though, I turned back around, seeing her gown. She was wearing a full-length dress with a leg slit at her thigh. All black. It had the same thin silver metal thread woven through it just above the slit, blooming into the design of roses. Around her chest it rose into lace, exposing some cleavage and the bulk of it ending at the height below her shoulder. More lace extending around her arms and resting at the bicep before dropping down to cover her arms and thin sleeves. Then across her upper chest and shoulders were thin strands of thread that weaved into a filigree lace choker adorned with intricate silver and subtle white crystal jewels. I saw her ear cuff for the witch hat, tying it all together well with her styled hair, freely flowing but still nobly kept. She put the finishing touches on a few strands of hair before staring at herself. I walked behind her, searing her image into my mind. How do I look? Do I look all right? She tilted her head back, looking up at me. You look beautiful. I put a hand on her arm, putting us together as we judged our profiles in the mirror. I sighed slightly. I couldn't even blink. I was captivated. You are the most beautiful woman I could ever conceive of. She silently looked back down at the mirror, barely holding back a smile, as we simply stood there, her body leaning against mine. It was only after a full minute that she muttered, "We're going to catch a lot of eyes." That was inevitable. Let them look. Let them be jealous. I bent down and kissed her neck, her hand reflexively moving to my own and clenching it slightly. Her body writhed a bit, a hot breath coming out and surprising me. You all right? Why, yeah. I've just been a bit more sensitive lately. This is about the time for the crown to finish settling in. Is it painful? No, not painful. Quite the opposite. My brows raised a bit as her face and neck flushed. I lowered my hand, deciding to test something. I brushed my palm over her thigh, sliding it into the slit in her dress and moving in. Her breath shuddered. Sensitive indeed. She had been completely cold over the last 2 months, absolutely nothing able to get her in the mood. I hadn't cared since I was either busy or tired 24/7 anyway, but she had been a bit depressed because she thought it was the side effect of being sterile. Now though, it seemed like those instincts of hers were coming back in full force. Terrace had told us it would take around 2 months for the crown to settle in completely, especially since the king blood wasn't the only ingredient. The timeline was matching, so maybe her reproductive system was finally active again. A good sign. Why you shouldn't. We'd be late. I suppose that would be wiser. My hand moved in anyway, finding a thin undergarment that came with her dress, and feeling it already sopping wet. She clutched my neck harder as my fingers glided over the soft, wet fabric, pushing, pressing, and kneading my way around. Her neck flushed red along with her face as I looked ahead at the mirror, taking in the sweet, agonizing picture of her face. So, I'm thinking we wear the gold accent suit and dress tomorrow. We can save purple for the last day. What do you think? So, go. Fuck. You know, since the third meeting will be followed by a gala, and we can't wear the same thing all 3 days. That would be so ignoble. Shoo. I glanced back down at her as she pulled on my neck. Shut up and kiss me. Well, if you insist. I smiled and went in for some tongue, simultaneously slipping my hand under her undergarment. Her body arched, her breath hitching as her fingernails threatened to split my skin in climax. We stayed that way with locked lips until around a minute later, when she finally came back down from her high enough to speak. Her breathing picked back up as well, as if she was tired, her skin from her upper chest to the tops of her ears completely flushed. Holy shit. I know. And we're only 2 minutes late. Should we run? And no, I need to change. She got embarrassed since her undergarment was basically soiled now, fluid dripping down her legs. I picked her up and carried her to the room. Here, I'll help clean up. Chapter 246, Apocryphon. March 1st, 626. The outside of the royal palace was as luxurious as someone would expect. Massive pillars held up a huge stone roof 150 feet above a man's head. With no walls, the pillars surrounded a floor of white and gold tiles that gleamed with the sun's light. The entire structure looked, from any earthling's eyes, like an oversized Greek temple such as the Parthenon. It was merely the entrance to the palace as a whole, an open-air plaza for those visiting. 2 large and pristinely cleaned roads led in and out of the plaza where currently, a few dozen carriages and closed vehicles rolled into. Just outside the plaza was a cluster of helipads bringing in the nobles who were rich enough to order a helicopter and influential enough to have already gotten one despite the months-long queue. There were dozens of people within the plaza itself already, most lingering around standing tables where servants brought small foodstuffs and pastries. The doors leading into the palace proper had yet to be opened, as it wasn't yet the designated time the king had decreed to enter. Not that any disrespectful noble would ever be late. All intended to arrive early, before the doors opened, and they would all wait for the king, not the other way around. More and more people gathered. Nobles, rich merchants, generals, brigadiers, marshals, sovereigns, famous enchanters, celebrities of the arts, their families, and anybody else who had the clout to find a way to be here at this historic gathering. A king's assembly hadn't been called in over 20 years. They were only called for matters that concerned the kingdom as a whole, matters that demanded the attention of everyone with a smidge of authority or influence to their name. Those who received the request to present themselves were the most critical. They could bring whoever they wished, and nobody outside of the requested or their entourage could show themselves. This meant everyone who was present within the palace would have a connection of some form to the most important people in the kingdom. This made it the most seismic gathering of people in the world, and made the assembly a time of extreme change and turmoil. For hours past sunrise, there were already 300 people gathered, the number constantly rising as vehicles ejected their occupants. Opulent carriages gilded with gold, white crystals, and the insignias of families from all corners of the kingdom came and went without end. Beautiful women, rich men, and people of disastrous power filled the large plaza. A few hundred servants rushed about to make sure that each of their needs and wants were catered to, while the personal servants coordinated with the palace servants to make sure masters couldn't be displeased. Counts were common, and earls and marquises were rising in population. At some point, dukes and duchesses started to arrive, most of them wearing a half-cape or sash denoting their military careers with medals and insignias. 6 hours past sunrise, and the plaza was looking crowded despite its expanse. Chatter reverberated off the ceiling, which was covered in vast art pieces depicting the glory of past figures of the kingdom. Everyone was distracted or in conversation, speaking with political allies and opponents, networking or referring to old promises and debts. The battle had already started, and yet, like the snacks, they were only a taster, an appetizer before the main dish. Talexia disembarked from a vehicle only an hour before the palace doors were supposed to open. Her arrival was announced, as it was for other marquises and dukes, and she caught most eyes. Faye and Icor were with her, both of them stepping out, dressed in their best for the occasion. There was nothing more formal than this, all three of them presenting completely new clothes designed especially for this occasion. The three walked in, Faye standing left of her mother and Icor right of his wife. Their faces were neutral, Faye allowing a small smile as she glanced around at the statues and artwork along the pillars. Once they had arrived at a small table nearest to the doors to the palace, Faye sighed and glanced at her mother. When were Amara and John coming? I don't know. They said they would be here not long after us. I'll send her a message. Faye tapped her aerial with a smile, sending a quick message. Then she waited, other people coming up to her parents for talks. Some of her friends flagged her down as well, so she went to mingle. 10 minutes passed, then 20, and she still hadn't gotten a response. When 30 minutes had gone by, Amara messaged back and said they'd be there soon. She sighed and waited some more, wondering what was holding them up so long. They were already in the capital and supposed to be nearby. John's house wasn't that far, so it couldn't take them long. She was slightly absent-minded with her friends, all noble girls from other households that she had clung to at the magisterium. She just wanted to see John. She continued to glance at the road leading into the plaza where more carriages and vehicles rolled into, dropping off nobles and celebrities with greater and greater renown. She tried to figure out which one could be theirs, but was always disappointed to see other faces pop through the doors. She turned away and focused on her conversation with her friends. Trying to pick him out would be no good with this many people and vehicles. But then she started to hear murmurs, glancing around before a shout came from the front. She and her friends snapped their heads to the road, eyes widening when they saw the vehicle. No, it was no vehicle. It was a metal monster. A behemoth. It came rolling across the road on two rough sets of metal double treads, standing 17 feet tall, 60 feet long, and 45 feet wide. Its body was completely covered in slanted plates of metal armor, all of them stacked with thick enchantments that visibly glowed with power. On top of its main body were two thick barrels mounted on two separately rotating segments, one on top of the other. The barrels were 15 feet long, and the hole in them were 5 inches in diameter. There were also 4 double-barrel man turrets, one on each corner of the tank. Faye stood and ran over, watching as the tank rolled into the plaza and forced crowds apart as it crushed some tables and parked itself right in the middle of the area. It was monstrous, Faye reading the name plastered on its side in crude paint. Regret. The two main guns rotated to face 2 different directions before it screeched to a halt. Royal guards were already swarming it, surrounding it, and pointing at it with spears, looking hilariously pitiful as a result. It sat there for several seconds. In that time, dukes moved closer, and a couple of grand dukes emerged from within the palace, the doors finally opening. Faye gawked when a hatch suddenly opened on the body and saw John climb out. He stepped onto the metal armor beside the massive gun, then reached down, a soft hand responding with a reach and taking his. Amara emerged, strikingly beautiful, her ethereal presence compelling everyone's attention. Faye's eyes snapped back to John, though, soaking up every bit of sharp masculinity radiating from that large frame. Why her sister had to be blessed with that man, she didn't know, but her envy was a foe she fought often. The two climbed down the tank gracefully, Amara floating down with air magic and John's shoes affording him the same capability. They landed together and quickly earned the intimate blades of the guards. State your identity. John looked at them with indifference, as if he couldn't see their spears pointed right at him. In his hand appeared the gilded letter from the king, stamped with the royal seal, and he flourished it as confidently as he should. I am John Cooper, allowed entry by the king's summons. If you're intending on threatening a guest, then go ahead, keep pointing those spears at me. We are the king's guard. A man suddenly walked through the crowds, large and overbearing in presence, with shined, intricate armor covering his body and a cape that flowed behind his steps. The Marshal of the Royal Guard, rumored to soon be advancing to Authority 12. He had a gray beard, but his presence was only bolstered by his age, wisdom tempered by years, lethality tempered by battles. Everyone backed away from him as far as they could before being stopped by those who still wanted to get a good look. He stepped up to John, both of them the same height. John didn't feel as overwhelming as the marshal, but there was still something about him that kept him in the minds of others. Perhaps it was the massive metal beast behind him. The surrounding guards all lifted their spears. With the marshal here, there was no more need to be on guard. He alone was enough to secure the area from anything short of a sovereign. Faye was nervous, the two looking like they were about to fight to the death. We ensure the sanctity of the royal family from all threats, no matter who or where. What is this thing you've brought, and why have you driven it into the plaza of the royal palace? Well, how nice of you to ask. John smiled nefariously, turning and waving to the mountain of cold steel behind him. Faye looked closer at the surface of the metal, suddenly seeing engravings across the body of the monstrosity. She saw names, ages, words beneath them. As she concentrated on it, she started to hear voices echo in her mind. The words started to radiate in her vision, feelings of desolation welling up within her. Goosebumps rose upon her skin, her breath hitching in fear when she realized what those words were, who the names belonged to. The crowds nearby, which started to chatter, hushed as the vehicle began to impose its weight upon the plaza. This is a gift, Marshal. A monument. To you, it will soon be known as the M300 Super Heavy Battle Tank. 640,000 pounds of cold steel, enchanted to the Authority 9 standard. Two 5-inch smoothbore main guns capable of launching a 50-pound projectile at nearly 2,500 meters per second. For double-barrel high-explosive spell turrets. All-terrain treads, and a full environmental seal with vacuum-rated self-sustainment capabilities. It is a warrior unto itself, a weapon the likes of which this world has never seen. But to me, John's face fell, his gaze forlorn, the entire plaza falling silent. Yet Faye could hear the screams. She could hear the spell fire, smell the blood, dirt, and metal. She gazed at one of the names carved into the armor of the tank. Gerald Fazenborn, 29 years old. And she didn't merely read the words underneath. They flashed through her mind. The cold blizzard, a steed being upturned as hundreds of monsters swarmed them. Jump out. Bring up a line. Fuck, we aren't going out like this. I refuse to die like this. Fucking kill them. Bring up dash. The flashing memory was suddenly interrupted, Faye's body jerking when she nearly felt the massive talon of a horrible monster rip through her neck. She felt sweat bead on her neck, realizing what this construct was. These were the death throes of the fallen, the echoes of the dead, all of them inscribed into the metal of that tank. She pulled her eyes away and focused on John. This battle tank is what could have been. If I had enough time, this would have been the weapon to hold the line. It is a weapon that will save millions, and yet it hadn't been made in time to save those who needed it most. So, Marshal, this is my gift to the king. To the kingdom as a whole, I bestow this machine of war. Revel in its harrowing beauty. I want all to gaze upon what could have been, and then I want them to remember this as we hold deliberations. John walked up to the marshal, to his side, and spoke in a low tone that yet everyone could hear, only just barely above the screams radiating from glimpses at the tank. He glanced at the letter still in his hand and whisked it away. I am here at the request of the king, Marshal. But I am not here as an enchanter or inventor, and I did not respond because of his request. Then, whose authority do you present yourself by? Not authority, Marshal. John waved toward the tank. The screams, the bloodshed, the echoes of death radiating from the metal and images imposing themselves onto the marshal's mind. I am here as their envoy. Do not deny their voice. John's arm lowered as he continued walking, Amara's arm linked to his. The cries of the slaughtered, their throes of regret, spilled forth from the metal coffin. Not afraid they wouldn't be heard, but a condemnation to those who knew they deserved it, and a reminder to the naive and heedless. Those who the assembly had been called for were here. He was here, who carried their afflictions. The sound of heavy breathing echoed from an alleyway, yet no passerby could see any figures when they walked by, dismissing it as a hallucination or trick of the wind, until there was a sudden blast of power, and a body came shooting out, colliding with another building and cracking the reinforced stone wall. Some black market buildings were built sturdier than others, yet the one who crashed into it lamented that fact, every ounce of impact shooting through her body. She clenched her teeth, forcing herself to stand, yet feeling her knee give out. She looked down and noticed a bloody line there. Her tendon hadn't been cut, but for some reason her mind didn't seem to believe that. She couldn't seem to use her leg. The attacker appeared in front of her, an invisible blade snaking its way around. She couldn't see it, but that hadn't stopped her from feeling every ounce of dread the blade carried. The number of battles it had been through, the number of lives it had reaped, both human and scourge. She couldn't yet fathom its abyssal depths, and that was merely what that blade carried. She looked up, seeing her attacker step out of his invisibility. It was a casual show of unfathomable skill that she couldn't hope to match, which pissed her off to no end. She moved to attack again, but he raised his hand in protest. "Stop. You're losing the point of this fight." "Again. I know what the point is." She spoke, yet her head fell, as if she didn't believe her own words. He sighed. "Theoretically, you do. But your body doesn't reflect that. Nothing you've done in the past 20 minutes has been for the sake of unearthing your aura. This fight is an opportunity, and you're treating it like a game of survival. Too much time on the battlefield." Plex clicked his tongue, looking down at Tana's pitiful figure. She was bruised and beaten, but according to him, that was all for the sake of learning. When pain was associated with failure, avoiding pain meant success. A simple formula that didn't seem to be working as he had intended. "At least you don't complain as much as John, though. Or demand as much. After all the things I've done for him. And he ditches me to run off to the military with his girlfriend and make his riches. Then he dumps his friend on me for training without another word. Or even a token of payment. I apologize for being the burden that I am. I don't like apologies." Tana chuckled at that. "John says the same thing. Hey, don't compare me to that ungrateful buffoon. I don't like apologies because I prefer money instead. It has nothing to do with the principles that kid thinks he holds so close to his chest." Tana straightened her body out, the lingering effects of Plex's attacks fading. They were as mysterious as they were effective, which only spoke to his ability. Yet he wasn't the greatest teacher, as she had learned. "I can get you paid." "By your father? Wasn't he that cheap son of a bitch out in the eastern orchards? Or do you come from a different shore online?" Yes and no." Then I won't count on it. Don't worry, I'll just go hunt John down. Lord knows the kid is damn near one of the richest men in the world now. Back when he was still scrounging for coin doing odd jobs dash. I'd like to get back on track, please." Tana interrupted before Plex could engage in more story time. Like some old man reaching the end of his lifespan, he had no issues talking for an hour at a time, and that was if he didn't go off on a few dozen tangents. Plex clicked his tongue again and waved his finger. "All right, girl, listen close. I see what you're trying to do, but it's impossible as you are now. Putting it simply, you fucked up somewhere along your path, and you're trying to backtrack more than develop yourself, but you can't even do that properly." "Yeah. So, tell me where it all changed. I'll give you some counseling and go charge John some more." Plex leaned against a nearby wall, Tana sighing and doing the same, just out of weakness. John may have been busy with his little revolution, but he didn't forget about his friends. After much deliberation and self-loathing, Tana had decided to take him up on his offer. So he dropped her on Plex's lap in the Founders Market without even asking him for assistance. It was nothing more than a sharp demand, and Tana had to press the man lest he get bored and ignore her. She wasn't disappointed in Plex as much as she was herself. After several days of training and getting to know each other, Plex had been able to figure her out, and the quality of his training, if it could be called that, skyrocketed. By now he had obviously seen through her, and yet what he saw wasn't hopeful. He had hit the nail on the head, and she decided to simply spill everything. "I hadn't had any path back at the magisterium short of making myself faint. But then I saw anarchy, and right after that, according to John's words, I was clinically dead for a few hours. While teetering on the edge of death, I felt something. It wasn't something that I had to reach out for, but something I had to fall into. But I was scared of it, so I didn't allow myself to. That's when I woke up, and after that, I adjusted my auric path based on what I had felt. It made me faint, made me nearly invisible to the senses, but it wasn't great. It was unfinished, scrappy, but far less than a proper technique." "That thing you felt." Plex looked her dead in the eye. In a rare moment of seriousness, she was able to feel his breadth of experience. She didn't know how powerful the man was, but that was precisely why she was so meek before him. Like John, she could feel nothing, and that was always the most dangerous feeling. That was real death. Had you fallen into it, you would have simply died. You're lucky that you got out of it. That by itself is impressive, but like any dream, it is fleeting. Your own mind dispelled those feelings to protect itself, and so you've never been able to make use of it since. Tana remained silent. She didn't know if he was correct, but it was probably the closest guess to the truth that she had ever heard. In hindsight, it made sense. But she just couldn't be sure, and that wasn't because she doubted him. She simply didn't have that feeling anymore. You couldn't make use of something that wasn't there anymore. So what do? Do I have to die again? A clinical death, as John put it. No. Plex shook his head, thinking seriously for a second. Tana remained silent, pondering about what John was doing at the moment. She knew that the king's assembly was ongoing, but she could bring no value to John there. This training was far more important for her. She also wasn't interested in seeing her father, who was assuredly present in every form. That man would never ignore an opportunity like that. Finally, Plex snapped his finger, an evil grin on his face. I have just the thing for you. What is it? That will be a surprise. Follow. He should be sleeping, but that'll make it all the more effective. Plex shot off, Tana quickly following despite her bruises screaming at her. They bounded across buildings before arriving at the trenches. Tana frowned at the smell and sight of bodies across the ground. The trenches were a relatively small part of the market, but they were a tightly controlled wasteland where all the undesirables flocked to. A small pond of no rules, all headed by one man. Tana didn't know much about it short of John's stories. It was just as disgusting as his sparse recollections. They even ran across a drug-fueled orgy in broad daylight, right in the middle of an intersection. Sweat, fluids, blood, and smoke were creating literal puddles on the dirt floor. Tana had to look away before she got nauseous. Finally, they made it to the center, the only place with any semblance of structure or order. A gang owned the nearby structures, and they were the only things put together in this hellscape. With all kinds of magical tools, they patrolled and fended off any drunken magi. In fact, they were patrolling so thoroughly that she wondered if they were being paranoid. What was there to defend against so vehemently? They bypassed the majority of the guards and landed right in the courtyard outside the headquarters. Once there, Plex turned to Tana. Already they were catching attention. You experienced death, Tana. And if you didn't have the talent, you wouldn't have been able to see that. But you need a sharp reminder of it. You've lost it, but not just because your mind purged the memory. After saying that, he waved his invisible blade. A sharp explosion of power later, and a major chunk of the headquarters building was blown away outright. Tana couldn't see anything but the result. She figured that he was trying to piss off the boss of this place. Was she supposed to fight him? If fights with Plex weren't going to be beneficial, then why would a fight with this head honcho be anymore? She wondered, but only until an aura spilled out of the building, seething with such rage that it sent shivers up Tana's spine. For a moment, she thought a king blood was here. But that was impossible. Plex looked at her seriously. This opportunity will only be afforded to you once. You experienced death of the body, and your body still remembers that. The experience has fused into your flesh and blood. But you can't make use of it, because no matter how much knights hate it, the body is only half of the weapon that is the human being. The aura from the headquarters continued to spill out, washing over Tana and filling her vision with hallucinations of a dreaded hell. It reminded her a lot of John's illusions, but far less complex. Instead, their reality came from the sheer power behind them. They were real because the person behind them was telling her that it was real, and he had the power to impose that upon her with impunity. Black spikes rose from the ground, pricking her eyes with the mere sight of them. Plex, you ungrateful son of a bitch. The roar almost made Tana pass out with sheer pressure, as if the aura could snuff out her mind by itself. Perhaps it could. She looked back at Plex, wondering what the man got her into. He smiled at her. Death of the body. Death of the mind. Acquire the other half, and maybe then you'll find what you're looking for. John won't give that to you, but Apocryon will. Completely and utterly. Tana's head snapped back to the headquarters, seeing a lunatic walk out of the building. He was seething with bottomless hatred, but she wondered why. How could destroying a part of a building warrant such thorough hatred? Looking back at him for questioning only made Plex laugh. Hee hee. You see, Apocryon is only able to sleep once every few months. So naturally, he hates being woken up. Anyway, use this chance wisely. I'm out. Plex promptly disappeared, Tana staring into thin air and gawking. Then, goosebumps rose on her skin, her body moving on pure instinct and dodging one of the many thousands of black spikes that were jutting out of the ground. She looked back and found Apocryon, that psycho, looking down at her from only 3 feet away. His eyes were bloodshot, his clothes mere rags, chemical burns all over his skin, and his body lean but unhealthily pale. His voice came out with a shudder, his rage overwhelming. Have you come to fucking kill yourself, girl? Why were you with that human piece of excrement? I've come to see if death is really as powerful as he claims to be. Tana drew her sword, her aura barely resisting Apocryon's to rest within her own body. The very act of moving placed strain on her mind. Show me. With pleasure. Apocryon gave her a mad smile before she suddenly felt a spike shoot through her spine, so fast and so powerful that even with all her vigor, she couldn't resist it. She was paralyzed, incredible pain shooting through her nerves, yet she was barely able to dispel the feeling with her aura. The spikes were illusions. Apocryon was a warlock, she was partially sure, but those spikes still weren't real. At least, that's what she initially thought. When 400 new spikes came and shot through every square inch of her body, impaling her thousands of different ways, she wasn't so sure anymore. She felt her mind slipping as sheer pain overwhelmed her. The only reason she could remain conscious was because Apocryon willed it. He walked up to her body, still skewered by all those barbed spikes. The last man that dared to disturb me lasted 53 hours. You will know death, just as you will know pain. She tried to scream as the spikes started growing through her body, tried to rationalize how it was possible that aura was capable of such. But she couldn't scream, her mouth mangled, and her mind was so overwhelmed that there was no thinking to be done. Apocryon reached out and grabbed her, ripping her disfigured body out of those spikes and making them shatter before throwing her toward the headquarters. The two disappeared within, Plex watching from afar, a neutral expression on his face. After some time he sat down, still watching, quietly waiting. Chapter 247, Ease of Use. March 1st, 626. After the doors opened to the royal palace, all of the nobles and prestigious persons flooded in and were guided to the Hall of Patrons. It was a massive hall made for events such as this, filled with tables and comfortable seating arrangements a level above the plaza, but being much more spacious, with 2 floors that allowed double the seating to accommodate the sheer amount of people. The hall was rich, walls covered in artifacts, paintings, statues, enchantments, and raw gold. Every square inch of material, visible or not, was expertly crafted and shaped. Hundreds of servants made sure that when everyone sat down, all of them were catered to. A lunch would be held first, and only then would the first meeting begin. As someone who received a direct invitation from the king, a table was set aside for me and those who I invited. But of course, I had brought nobody but Amara. And since everyone was required to declare their specific guests beforehand, given that I only came with one, Amara and I were accommodated a single, relatively small table for our dining experience. The 2 of us were near the middle of the 2nd floor, where all the noble patrons were dining, above the rest of the crowds who had to deal with the 1st floor like peasants. We stuck out like a sore thumb, everyone else having entire families or entourages around them, massive tables accommodating a dozen or 2 people each. But Amara and I couldn't find it in ourselves to care. We simply spoke to each other for the duration of the lunch, indulging in the premium food, ignoring everyone around us. Our words were exclusive, the wonders of aura and magic ensuring that nobody else could eavesdrop. Not a single person came to interrupt us, even though we earned long stares and dozens of messages on our aerials. It was quite funny for the 2 of us. Nonetheless, what we did send was a message. I had no illusions about the power dynamics surrounding me. I knew that there were dozens of people who held interest in my industry, nobles who wanted my machines of war to bolster their own forces, others who wanted to tap my resources. I knew that any noble worth their salt had heard about the mines and processing facilities I had bought up. And while I kept a tight lid on everything, the most general facilities still had hundreds of workers, many of which were common folk, and it was impossible to keep information from spreading. Of course, nothing that ever spread could risk anything of mine, so I wasn't concerned. But just because I wasn't concerned didn't mean others wouldn't take it upon themselves to impose. An event like the King's Assembly was a political battleground for a reason, and anybody atop of it was a part of it, whether they liked it or not. And yet I was refusing to play. In the eyes of others, I was a foolish young man who knew nothing about anything, a child who had dove head first into the ocean of noble politics and made big waves before daring to simply sit back and act haughty, as if nothing could concern me. Would it be childish of me to say that they were the ones who knew nothing? I didn't care either way. I knew how to think ahead, and I had ensured my industry with independence. My vertical integration didn't rely on any noble I didn't have an absolute or predictable relationship with, which was to say that the land my mines and facilities operated on wasn't under the jurisdiction of anyone besides Telexia or the Raven family and the Wedded City, two entities who I knew would never betray me, both because of personal ties as well as because right now, I was making them assloads of money. The Holy See wasn't the only entity that received my tech. While not as fast, the Raven Chief was revamping his mining, material processing, manufacturing, construction, and even agricultural industries. Sooner rather than later, his material industries would be outproducing the whole of the kingdom by themselves, which would only help me later on. It was safe to say that my few allies were absolute, and no noble could affect or hamper me if I didn't want them to. Not unless they used the law against me, but I had my own plans for that, most revolving around my middle finger. Lunch passed leisurely for Amara and I. Neither of us were particularly worried about how things would go. Recent experiences made us rather numb to anything but the worst stresses a person could feel. Something like a tea party in the royal palace, while completely new territory for both of us, was hardly scary. Getting stared down by brigadiers and marshals? As if that could compare to a king blood or corrupted at the same levels trying to murder us in the worst possible fashion and barely managing to escape with our lives after killing thousands of monsters. After lunch finally came to an end nearly 3 hours later, everyone finally started to divide. Only those directly given a letter were allowed to attend the meeting, as well as a single person the invited had the option of bringing. Everyone else who had been brought along were to wait outside, whether that was mingling in the hall where music was playing and food was endlessly served, or bouncing around to private rooms made available, engaging in background political maneuvering or secret affairs, as if every wall didn't have an ear behind it. Amara and I, along with all the other invited, were led to the assembly hall. There, we were seated around a massive golden table covered in beautifying jewels, carvings, inlaid metal and glass, and enchantments. The king sat at the head of the table, the side of which was completely reserved for him, and the 4 Grand Dukes of the Kingdom of Dragon Tongue who were able to show up. The first was Grand Duke Anselma Sephir, someone I had spoken to personally. Considered perhaps the smartest warlock, and some would argue the smartest person, in the kingdom, he headed the Magic Spire and led the greatest magical development projects humanity has ever seen. That was until I showed up, of course, but that was beside the point. The second was Grand Duke Intima Ozaneth. He was Telexia's direct superior, one of 2 sovereign warlocks in the Warlock Corps. He wasn't a tall man, but he was a pretty boy with blonde hair who opted to wear flashy suits instead of warlock robes. No matter, because those suits were loaded with powerful enchantments anyway. I didn't know much about the man beyond that. The third was Grand Duke Adam Euzoris, a sovereign knight of the Night Corps. He was the sovereign stationed at the treehouse when it fell, the same sovereign who was too cowardly to fight the enemy and ran away, leaving everyone to die or fight for their own retreat. A man with a sharp beard and beady eyes, he looked rather distinguished, gentlemanly, and pleasant. I still remember when he first arrived at the treehouse during Polly's promotion to Brigadier General. Too bad that he was a scum-sucking cretin not worth the talent he was given. The fourth was Grand Duke Haleomeve, another warlock of the Warlock Corps. She was an older woman, aged gracefully, either approaching her 2nd century or beyond it based on her gray hair and power. I knew people could live far beyond 100 years. Amara's family had a couple ancestors beyond their 2nd century. It was still a bit jarring to see such an ancient being in person, though. I could feel the experience behind her. Another one of Telexia's superiors. I had never met, seen, or heard anything about her beyond the fact that I was placed under her command for a time when I went into the military. Since marshals were usually the ones to handle business, I only ever heard or saw their names from reports, not a sovereign's. I had little intel about the old lady, not enough to make an impression beyond her simple but rich appearance. The other 3 Grand Dukes that I knew of were Grand Dukes Petula Tahith, the warlock who had been stationed at Purple Sky when it fell to anarchy, Grand Duke Dacelis Kinnear, a knight, and Grand Duke Pharaoh Runius, another knight. Those three couldn't be here today as they were manning other bases, making sure the Scourge couldn't launch a sudden attack while the sovereigns were away. The immediate sides of the table sported those closest to the king. He had advisors, a few generals, and other nobles and politicians closely tied with the royal family. That included the Iberan dukedom, the family that the queen hailed from. Beyond them, further away from the king, was everyone else. Other nobles, Maricuses whose statuses didn't warrant them a close seat, dukes who didn't care to fight for a closer spot, and other influential personages who held power beyond the obvious noble title. To my right was Amara, and to her right was San, who came alone. Polly had been invited, so she brought Jasmine and the two of them sat beyond San. To my left was Ikor, and to his left was Telexia, who made sure she would be near me. To her left was the Raven family chief, who had made sure to sit next to a familial ally. The Telarias and Ravens went back centuries. Naturally, they would stick together. Besides them, there were full generals and major generals spotting the chairs. After all, this assembly was called primarily due to recent catastrophic defeats on the war front. Everyone here had some kind of hand in the war effort, whether that was directly or indirectly, economically or politically. It was the only reason I had been invited specifically. I myself have become an integral part of the war as a whole. My inventions, and now riches, afforded me a massive amount of influence. Some might think that my brashness or arrogance meant that I didn't understand the kind of influence I had. Those people were idiots and not worth any more than an acknowledgement that they existed, and by extension, they wouldn't be the true players in this game. Those with any brain would understand that I didn't lack self-awareness, and even then, there was nobody here who could truly grasp the extent of my intellect and how thoroughly I understood my position. There was not a single person in the kingdom who had ever come close to understanding the kind of power Psycho afforded me, so long as Maxwell wasn't considered a part of the kingdom. It took half an hour for everyone to finally settle around the table. Once there was silence, the king spoke. "Welcome, everyone. You all have my gratitude for responding to the king's assembly." He gave his greeting, a whole prepared speech that meant nothing to me. Today is the first day of our deliberations. Today, we will discuss the topics that will demand our attention for the following 2 days. Naturally, the reason this assembly was called is the fronts of our war against the Scourge. With the recent fall of the Treehouse and the fall of Purple Sky only a few years ago, the coverage of our western and northwestern fronts have been critically reduced, giving the Scourge an opening to launch attacks on the bases before the River of Desolation. Thus, by the end of the 3rd day of the assembly, we must have an answer to our dilemma, as well as all the problems surrounding the establishment of a new front. We will ensure that these failures cannot repeat themselves, but it will take the cooperation of everyone here today. So, let us officially begin our first assembly. The table flashed with his announcement. I saw a name card appear in front of me, obviously with my name on it. It was the same for everyone else. I was able to quickly memorize every face, name, and title at the table. It was, however, not the only thing I noticed given a bit of time and observation. My aura was pulled in. Nobody was letting theirs run free here. Only the sovereigns were allowed to, and even they were keeping themselves quiet. Otherwise, there'd be a whirlwind of power in the hall, and nobody would be able to think straight. However, just because my aura was reduced to my body didn't mean that I couldn't see what was installed below the floors. The aura shields of the 3rd claw, holding back the urge to look straight at them. I could sense a large room directly below us. It took a few seconds, but I was able to quickly see through the shield they had boxed the room in, as if trying to make it some kind of magical Faraday cage. I likened the shield to a compromise between a maze and an encryption. The aura shield could be seen through because it didn't actually block aura nor magic. It simply forced them through so many layers of translations and misdirections that the observer simply couldn't make sense of what was left, thus inducing the illusion of having seen nothing at all, as if they were looking at solid ground. But in the end, the shield was non-destructive, like a blurred image or refracting glass pane. All the data was still there, and it could get through the shield. All you needed was an observer encoded with the right directions to get through the shield, like a formula or password to an encryption. Or, you just needed to be smart enough to decipher it yourself. It was possible for me because I could track thousands of avenues at the same time, easily seeing through the maze they tried to misdirect everyone else through. Even sovereigns, so long as they didn't brute force it, would be tricked by it. And even they could only brute force it if they knew it was there in the first place. They probably did know, could probably see the tiny passive magical conduits through the floor and track them to an odd structure underneath them. But they obviously didn't care. The 22 observers in the room weren't aimed at them. I spoke through my telepathic connection with Amara, which had been active this whole time. I may not be able to use it over distances, but when we were this close, it was easier than breathing. The floor has ears. Sorry, there are people watching us from below. Secret observers in a room beneath the hall. I tapped Amara's mind, feeding her an outline of the room. She kept her eyes up. Smart girl. Oh, that somehow doesn't surprise me. Third claw, most likely. That are just another covert branch of the royal family. All the same in the end. I'll make sure to be careful. If you could, alert my mother and those it may concern. We don't want them thinking they can speak freely, even in private rooms. Of course, I quickly did so, informing San, Telexia, Ikor, and the Raven Chief, plus his wife. All of them were grateful for my warning. Not that they weren't already planning to be careful. It wasn't crazy to imagine that every wall had an ear. I remained silent as the king went over the various topics that needed to be discussed. It took him an hour just to do that. First was consolidating and evaluating the total manpower of the military. After having lost over 250,000 troops over a 4-month time span, the military was in dire need of a consensus and redistribution of power. The consensus could be done, but before they could adjust forces, they needed to establish where new bases would be built. New battle lines needed to be drawn, new bases needed to be built, and most importantly, the manpower had to come from somewhere. Yet another topic of deliberation. Where would the soldiers come from? With so many people having died, that wasn't as easy of a question to answer as it was before the fall of the treehouse, and not simply because the pool was smaller. Besides the more obvious military matters, another matter of deliberation was my aircraft and their role on the battlefield. It was clear to everyone that they needed to be an integral part of every army. Close air support, bombing runs, air transport. They were extremely valuable offensively, defensively, strategically, and logistically. They were the only reason the treehouse hadn't fallen much sooner. The reason that although we had lost so many troops, we took many more monsters with us. Nobody could deny their role or their utility. The question was, how many were there, and how would they be distributed across the entire theater? Almost all of them had been sent to the treehouse because for a time, it was the sole focus of the Scourge, and San wanted me to have as much support as possible. That would no longer be the case. Other generals, and more importantly, other sovereigns wanted to get their hands on aircraft and armament, and as far as they knew, there was an extremely limited supply. That would be a great surprise for them, to hear that now it was quite the opposite, but now wasn't the time to mention it. The time would come later. Of course, my aircraft wasn't the only economic topic. A massive movement of soldiers, as newly constructed bases would demand, would require a massive economic movement as well. Weapons to manufacture, armor to craft, vehicles to construct, food to transport, workers to send off, and many, many tons of materials to process and enchant. There would be people losing a lot of money and people making a lot of money, which would be decided by the taxes involved as well as subsidies from the crown and who could fight for a good position. The positions would be determined by who could win the political battles after everyone left this room. But the taxes and the new laws instituting them would be determined by the king and the concessions of the advisors, grand dukes, and dukes. This was only because each industry had its limits, unlike my own. That was a thought I needed to make sure Amara and San kept in mind for when nobles started coming to us in an attempt to force us any one way. Of course, we wouldn't be able to avoid everything outright, but I had my plans for that which we couldn't ignore. After an hour or so of discussing which topics needed to be discussed, the meeting moved on to discuss the recent defeats themselves. Reports were passed around, the prime report being Polly's since she was, officially, the only surviving intelligence agent at the level of general. She was only a brigadier general, but based on seniority, she was considered the one and only person who had a true grasp on the fall of the treehouse. Nobody else had survived to say otherwise, short of the sovereign. The assembly went and blabbed about the defeat, nothing I didn't know in intimate detail since it was only a reflection. They wanted to know where things went wrong, who went wrong, and why it went wrong. An hour later, and the blame was being passed around. Nothing but conjecture since anybody they could blame was dead. Nobody would blame the sovereign. And although some scrutiny was thrown Polly's way, she was only a brigadier general, so it wasn't like she could take responsibility even if she wanted to. It was never in her hands. It was a lot of talk that went nowhere, nothing unexpected. So another hour later, and they finally started to shift topics from what went wrong to how they would attempt to recover. It was only light talks. The king delegated the tasks of getting a consensus to the generals, who in turn gave out the commands via aerial to subordinates to collect data for the next day. After that, a large map was brought out and many people started giving input about where new bases should be constructed. Arguments quickly ensued. Many nobles wanted the bases to be placed closer to their cities so they could become a transfer hub, which would make them money. Benefits were masked with strategy. More blaming was thrown around, as if supply lines were ever the issue, and then they started talking more logistical details. That's where my name was thrown around. I kept silent, even when mentioned, simply staring and watching. Marquises went around blabbering as if my silence was somehow an agreement to hypothesize my cooperation. Airfields and planes were contrasted with wagons and rails. The pros and cons of both were weighed with major biases, since none of them knew the true costs of construction and manufacture. I said nothing. Now was not the time for me to get involved. The only people talking were the small-time nobles who happened to own territory near the River of Desolation. They wanted to make sure that if transportive logistics were to utilize aircraft, I would know that their doors were open for quick and easy accommodation. As if I couldn't just make a supply center myself and reap every benefit instead of sharing with them. Their talk was nothing but assumptions, not worthy of me even considering, nor deserving of my voice. But the point was to open the topic for discussion in the first place, to flesh out the many possibilities so that when everyone retreated to private rooms, they would have the ideas at hand and ready to weaponize for the most possible benefits. Because of that, it became clear that I was a major player. My planes had a nearly equal impact on the general economy as it did the military. It was subtle only to normal citizens who occasionally saw them in the air. Every noble knew that I had the capacity to take over transportation and logistics in every industry, from agriculture to mining, and that was just with planes, not even considering new vehicle and even train designs Wonderland had already tested. So when I multiplied the number of aircraft in circulation, and then added hyper-efficient vehicles and trains on top of it, the effects would be global, and I would be at the center of another small revolution. They knew it. I knew it. Question was, would they try to hurt me or help me? And who would I cooperate with? It was all up to me. I had all the cards. The benefits of being a monopoly. I could make or break everything. My decisions could affect where bases were built, if new cities were created behind them. The only downside was that if the king could see that as deeply as few others could, then he might try to stick his hand in my business, forcefully. I could still do little before the monarchy, the supreme power of this land. There were no laws that could protect me from him because he and the sovereigns could change them to suit their interests. And if I fought it, I'd lose everything instead of just a small portion of my business. My balancing act was with him, not other nobles. And yet, how we balanced each other would reflect through those same nobles, the pawns in this game. I could see it all. Extremely few knew that I could, and yet I loathed playing the game. I had to be careful about outright refusing, but that fact only pissed me off more. It was why I gave the church all my tech already. In their hands, it would thrive with or without me while I fought for a slice of the pie in the kingdom. No, not a slice of the pie. I had made my own pie and now I had to dish it carefully, balancing between revealing how large my pie was and showing everyone that there were limits to the slices I gave out, so that they didn't think they could take advantage of my success. I love pies. I started dozing off at some point, the lessers around the table continuing to argue, continuing to throw my name out occasionally. I just pondered other things worth my brain power, and yet every word uttered was still memorized in perfect clarity. After another handful of hours and absolutely no productive conversation later, the king finally ended the first meeting. Everyone rose and left the hall, moving into the dining area once more where dinner was already being prepared. The next two meetings would be the juicy ones. Dukes and sovereigns would finally start speaking, and I'd probably have to step in. I wouldn't be surprised if I ended up talking to some with San, making deals and promises. After all, San and I were the head of the defense industry, and by bringing the tank here we had already shown that we were here to advertise. We had many new products, and all of them would affect these deliberations. I planned to let Amara handle the deals behind closed doors. However, I could control myself and play politics, but I had no interest in doing so. I'd piss off too many people simply because I knew I could. But since I agreed that it wasn't the smartest route, I had to let Amara handle things first. If they fell out of her hands, then I'd happily step in and draw the hard line. I'd be the bad cop in that situation, and perhaps then people would rethink whether they wanted to give Amara a hard time. Dinner came and went, Amara and I seated at another small table by our lonesome. Several people finally came up to us during that time, asking for our presence behind closed doors. Amara stepped up and handled all of them. And after those who came realized that I wouldn't be entertaining them personally, they deferred to her. Of course, I'd be there anyway, but they knew where I stood. And so dinner ended. Night had fallen by then, and yet there was much to be done. I wouldn't be surprised if the majority of those at the table would be pulling all-nighters. Amara and I would be, most likely, and then we'd be getting straight into the next day and meeting, perhaps buying ourselves a couple hours of sleep, if we were lucky. Finally, the time came to enter the private rooms of the royal palace. I could see aura shields everywhere, one or two people behind them, watching, recording, and stashing data for later. How much dirt and info they had remained to be seen. But I didn't plan on being naive either. I had already planted my seeds in the church. The kingdom would not be exempt from this, but I wanted to go straight to the core. I hardly cared about little nobles and their scandalous affairs. I wanted the deep, dark secrets of the third claw. They knew how to isolate information just like the church did. But now, I was in the royal palace. There was no better place to inject another seed program. Of course, they wouldn't allow me to go wandering. But once again, I had my own plans, and it started on the first night. Amara and I entered a room. Inside being a marquis of a southern territory, one rich in agricultural exports. Naturally, he was interested in our products, and I had decided to start with this little noble. We gave our greetings, and after some pleasantries, Amara smiled and brought out a little box. "Marquis, I have a gift for you." She held out the box, opening it to reveal an aerial. Gilded, luxurious, comfortable, more functional than any other aerial. A new user interface, a built-in browser, intuitive access to NodeNet sites. It was easy, it was pretty, and mostly importantly, it was free. Amara pushed the box forward, the Marquis taking it with glimmering eyes. Son Industries' newest aerial. "We want you to have it, a token of our goodwill. With it, we'll be able to engage in more business with each other." I barely held back a smile as the Marquis put it on, replacing his old one. The new aerial automatically transferred all his data, all his contacts, all his messages with a simple tap. He was shocked at how easy it was. How he could simply start using his new fancy aerial with no trouble or hassle. In fact, he was so pleased that he tossed the old one across the room, reveling in our nice gesture and flattering us with compliments, eager to please and get in our good graces. All I saw was the first of its namesake. Amara gave the man a stunning smile. "It is called the Trojan. We hope you enjoy its ease of use." Chapter 248. Tempting. Long after night had fallen, in the deep darkness of the royal plaza, the super-heavy battle tank continued to sit ominously, not knowing how to drive the thing. It had been left until John Cooper could be talked to about getting a driver to relocate it. And since nobody knew how to drive it, and it was built to be nigh indestructible, none of the guards believed that it needed to be watched. More importantly, none of them wanted to watch it. Looking at those engraved names for too long drove a few of the guards to paranoia. It did nothing like make them mad, so it wasn't deemed dangerous, but it had just enough of an effect to, over time, bury its image into the minds of those too close. Not even servants dared to clean the tables and food that the tank had crushed under its treads. Splinters and crushed pastries continued to go stale around it, and when one ordinary servant girl had been forced to draw near, she was overtaken by the visions and had dropped to the ground, passed out. When woken, she expressed horror, thinking she had been the one whose heart had been ripped out of her chest by a scourge monster. Until it could get moved, the plaza was an exclusion zone, barren, only illuminated by the city beyond, until it suddenly wasn't. A woman, draped in black and walking with her head down, headed straight toward the tank from the doors leading to the palace proper. Her steps were measured, but anxious. She slowed as she approached the tank, looking up at it once it had easily eclipsed her figure. She trembled faintly as the screams and harrowing visions entered her mind, but she was powerful enough to hold herself together. After all, she recognized one of them. It was calling her. "I hear you. Where are you?" She muttered and stepped toward the cold steel of the front armor plating. Her eyes slowly shifted from one name to another, reading each one and moving on once she understood that it wasn't the one she sought. She went around the tank, stopping at the large painted letters of its name. Regret. She gazed upon those letters, freezing as she saw the engravings within them. They were formations so horribly complex that she couldn't fathom what they did, and yet the voice within screamed at her. She reached out, touching them, and causing them to flash with brilliance. Her vision went white, and within her own mind she saw the past. The brilliant battle, the terror of unholy light, screams and explosions that rend the planet. They slammed through her mind, and despite being Authority 9, she threatened to outright collapse. She kept her feet subconsciously. More visions of annihilatory battles flashed, some of them carrying esoteric meanings. All she understood was the desperation, the fight against all odds, against an Authority 11 king blood of unholy light. She shuddered as a single image of it was seared into her mind. But the image was not of the king blood living, nor its obscene strength. It was its death at the hands of that she sought. She saw her husband crushing the king blood's head into pulp. The almighty heroism of the image burned into her neurons such that she could never forget even if she wanted to. As if the formations were afraid that she wouldn't understand the depth of the sacrifice. Once the image was implanted, she recoiled away from the cold metal, the formations going lifeless. She started falling, but there was suddenly a pair of hands to catch her. It took her almost a minute to regain herself. It was only then that she looked up, finding him. John Cooper, the last man to fight alongside her husband. Avisha cried, his blank face staring down at her. It was cold, nearly lifeless, emotionless. There was no sorrow in it. But there was also only one person who could have put those formations there. That tank was more than just a weapon. It was a symbol. It was his regret. Suddenly, he held out a ring. She recognized the wedding ring. It doubled as a spatial storage, something she had custom ordered for him. I had to crack the seal on it. But rest assured, everything is still there. She reached out and took it with shaking hands. The funeral still hadn't been held. Everyone had been too busy. There had been too many dead, and the military was still recovering from the massive blow it had taken. There was little time for holding ceremonies. That was why she had fought to be at the assembly. It would be the only place she could find John Cooper. There had been so many things to say, so many hateful curses, so many sorrowful mourns, so many empathetic comforts. She wasn't sure if she hated this man. She had gotten so many messages about him. Nanan had told her that, when the battles were over, he wanted her to meet him. Now she had, and she had no words. When she looked at him, she felt like there was nothing to say, nothing that he hadn't already thought of, no amount of curses that he hadn't already said to himself. His neutral voice echoed in her mind again. I will be hosting a funeral in the coming months for the Snow Doves, but I want to hold one for you and your family as well. For Nanan, if you're okay with being in contact. He held out his aerial, one she didn't recognize. After some thought, she touched hers to it, exchanging information. Then she steadied herself on her own feet, his hands retreating from her. She straightened her dress and, after receiving a handkerchief from him, wiped her face. She took a few shuddering breaths to calm herself before nodding. I would appreciate that, Sir Cooper. It's the least I'll be doing. You have a blank check for the event. Just let me know what you want to do, no matter the expense. It can be as grand or as small as you wish. Very well. What about his body? I have him, but I'll be holding on to him for now. The remnant power lingering in his body and ashes is dangerous. It's already slowly destroyed 2 spatial rings, so I need to find a way to contain it safely before handing it off. I understand. Thank you. John just nodded before turning. I must return for now. If you wish to talk further or discuss any details, you have my personal contact. Don't hesitate to use it. I understand. She nodded back as he walked away, leaving her next to the tank. The voices no longer screamed at her. As if realizing that she was related to the fallen, they avoided her, seeking out those who deserved their torment. Once John disappeared beyond the doors to the palace, Avisha fell to her knees. She clutched her dress, and she screamed alongside the memories of the dead. March 2nd, 626. The second day of deliberation came. I sat in my designated chair of the meeting room, just like the day before. Except now, there were half the amount of people at the table. Most of the plus ones that had been brought the day before were all gone, the night before having been filled with endless talks. Those at the table, at least those of sufficient status, didn't do most of the talking, leaving their subordinates to do it for them. Those subordinates were now sleeping while the invited were here to engage in the real discussions. Today would lay half the foundation for the future. Amara wasn't here, having retired after we ate breakfast together. As for me, although I was going on 24 hours, I had my psyche to keep me sharp. I could stay up for another few days if I really wanted to. The only reason that didn't usually happen on the front lines was because I was usually fighting for my life in those situations. But now, I could use my power for something other than slinging hate at ungodly monsters. Having psyche made mundane things like pulling off all-nighters easy. I still felt completely fresh, psyche streaming through my brain and augmenting my mental faculties. Currently, there was a large map on the massive table before us. It detailed the area around the northwestern front that had recently fallen, including the locations of the now toppled stronghold Charlie and Treehouse. A few major decisions would be made today. First would be the location of the new bases that had to be established. Second would be determining the main method of transportation between them, whether that was to be an underground rail line, road, or plane. Third would be detailing the logistics of procuring troops, as well as assessing intel regarding scourge movements in the area. The enemy would determine how many people needed to be sent, but what would determine everything else was where the new bases were established. That's why everyone looked at the map intently. The overarching goal was to hold the scourge beyond the River of Desolation. It was the line in the sand, but the issue was that Stronghold Charlie wasn't that far away from it. Stronghold Charlie was located near the edge of a mountain range. Between that mountain range and the river was a large swath of desert, untouched and uninhabited. Thankfully, the mountain range went all the way to the coast, so it would be difficult for the scourge to simply route around us. Their easiest path would be to continue beyond Stronghold Charlie and hit the desert before reaching the River of Desolation. The only reason we would be able to take the desert from them is because that intestine hadn't grown that far yet. It was progressing, probably faster than ever, but it still took time. If we moved fast enough, we'd be able to establish a bulwark in the desert and at least fight them back to the mountain range. Thanks to my planes once again, everyone was able to look at detailed images of the landscape in question. The desert was mostly open, but if one of the bases was positioned correctly in relation to the river, that wouldn't be an issue. Stronghold Charlie had the advantage of terrain on its side, but so long as I had any say, the wide-open desert would be far more advantageous to me than the mountains. It took a dozen seconds to think of 3 new places for 3 new bases, places that were both easily defendable and close enough to other bases for easy cooperation. Only one of those positions would be certain, however. It would be the one furthest west, the position that would both take the largest brunt of the Scourge's hatred and be the farthest from established human cities. The other 2 positions were closer to the river and therefore closer to other cities. That meant the nobles would fight for those position changes like their lives depended on it. If they managed to argue for a good base position, they'd set themselves up economically for years. I was only worried about the certainty. There was light conversation around the table, small mindless comments about the population figures for the other strongholds and reserve forces. However, everyone was looking at the map and staring at that barren swath of land, the future battleground against the Scourge. It was finally time for me to step in. I stood, immediately catching the eyes of all nobles, generals, and the king. My movement was deliberately slow, one of my hands raising and reaching out. Psyche fluttered off my hand, washing over the focus of the map and dropping a pin on one very particular spot on one of the detailed images. For the first time I spoke. This position, right here, is where we need to establish the next stronghold. It will be the one to not just survive the Scourge, but push them back. My voice echoed in the assembly hall, silence prevailing for a short time as generals and nobles looked at me, stupefied, as if it was asinine to think that I would ever offer my opinion. One of the generals, full General Heuser, responded. He was supposedly in charge of a stronghold further to the east, not a rear position, but far more pampered than the western bases were. After all, they had the church over there to handle the vast majority of the fight. You so confidently declare that the position you chose is the correct spot? Are you simply arrogant? Now, General Heuser, the king waved and smiled. His confidence must come from somewhere. As smart of a man Sir Cooper is. I'd like to hear his reasoning. I glanced at the king, then at the general, who reluctantly fell silent. Then more of my psyche poured over the map, leaving icons and outlines detailing the most predictable presence of the scourge and their future movements. My reasoning is simple. The scourge wants to grow their gargantuan intestine beyond the mountain range around the fallen stronghold Charlie. That intestine is what their army revolves around. It is their supply line in just about every conceivable fashion. Food, water, resources, monsters, royals. They all come from it, but they don't stray too far either. So we have some time before they advance out of the mountain range and into the desert in the south. Why bother marching millions of monsters through tough terrain when you can simply wait for the intestine to grow? So if I'm being honest, the exact position of the main combat base isn't the most important factor. However, the pin on my chosen spot flashed once more. The reason I chose this position is because it would be the most suitably offensive position. I disagree. General Heuser stated, standing as I did and motioning toward the map. Is it not obvious how, on the contrary, that position is the worst defensively? It's in the middle of the open. There are clear flat channels leading straight to it, channels of land that the scourge can easily use to flood toward the base and annihilate it. Stronghold Charlie was strong because it utilized the mountainous terrain to its advantage. That's why it was able to stand so long. And the hills around the treehouse were why it wasn't immediately overwhelmed when the scourge started pressing its attack. So how could the position you chose possibly be anything other than a death sentence to every troop sent there? I let out a small sigh, admiring the general's ignorance. To think that they had been on the back foot so long that they no longer understood the concept of offense. General, I'm amazed at your misunderstanding. Huh, I'd love to hear this, he cackled. A rookie summoner invents a few things and thinks that he can dictate strategy to me. You're 70 years too early to do that, boy. Age does not equal wisdom, General. Don't be a fool and listen. You might learn something. What did you? I interrupted him with a snap of my fingers, my psyche gently permeating the entire room and carrying my words. The general continued to bark, but I simply spoke anyway, my voice carried into the minds of everyone within earshot. I didn't choose this position because it was easily defendable. In fact, I chose it because it was quite the opposite. Indeed, there are channels that the scourge could use to flood monsters toward it. However, that can only happen if the scourge is there to do so. If they are alive to do so. I tapped the table again, figures of my tanks, planes, armored vehicles, and all the amazing weapons atop them appearing on the map. Unlike you, General Heuser, I'm tired of simply sitting there and letting the scourge claw at us without contest. And all your words have done is help me understand that you, just like many others, have forgotten what it means to take the fight to the enemy. If the kingdom continues to sit idly like this, the day that the scourge reaches the river of desolation will be inevitable. I am not the only one who sees it. However, I am the only one who can offer the solution. Everyone here has seen the super heavy battle tank that continues to sit within the Royal Plaza. 640,000 pounds of solid steel, so dense with enchantments that when we were testing the armor's tolerances, some spells would explode inches away from the armor, coming in contact with mana so dense that it acted as its own barrier. Those guns atop it are capable of putting holes through bombardos from several miles away. And you know what the best part is? Right now, there are 300 more of those tanks just outside of the walls of the capital. I tossed a projector out, a live video from a helicopter in the air showing all of the tanks lined up in rows outside the city walls. Even more, there were thousands of people around them, citizens from within the city who had been ushered by Son Industries workers to go and view the metal behemoths. Everyone at the table leaned forward, wanting for a closer look. General Heuser scowled, yet even he couldn't tear his eyes away. This right here, ladies and gentlemen, is the future of warfare. These are just 300 of our largest tanks. And yet, at the end of this month, I will have another 1,000 of our smaller model, one that weighs 150,000 pounds, to complement them. And that isn't counting the fleet of armored vehicles I'll have the month after. What people like General Heuser fail to understand is that my planes were only the first step toward what I'm calling mechanized warfare. I waved toward the live video, which quickly switched to a recorded video of a live fire test. The super heavy battle tank fired at a massive metal wall about a mile away, and when the projectile slammed into the metal surface, it penetrated deep and then detonated, blasting not just a massive hole through the metal structure, but sending a sharding projectile beyond the wall and farther out beyond. Humanity cannot match the scourge in sheer numbers. They will always have us beat. They breed like heathens and then send their filthy spawn right at our walls without care for death or carnage. Humanity's magic has done well to hold them back for so long. However, it has become clear in recent months that our simple numbers are no longer enough. The only reason the treehouse hadn't fallen sooner was because my planes were dropping thousands of bombs a day on the massive hordes of Scourge, murdering hundreds of thousands of them before they could even launch their attack. Do not think for a second that it was just the mountains that held the Scourge. It was my industry that stopped them, and now, it'll be my industry that will drive them back. I wiped away all the other images above the map, focusing back on the pin I dropped denoting the location of the base. This position, General Heuser, is the best because it will allow me to send my tanks and utilize my vehicles to the greatest effect. With no mountains, no trees, and no barriers in our way, the Scourge will have nowhere to hide. They will simply watch as bombs hail down on them from above. They will tremble as armored vehicles rush out to annihilate their detachments scattered across the land. They will be crushed under treads as my tanks roll across sand and dirt to deliver hellfire from their cannons. With my industry, with my technology, we will take the fight to them. We will drive them back as they come flooding from the mountain range, not simply sit there like cowards, as someone like you might suggest. I grinned as he roared in protest. Without me speaking, everyone was able to hear his voice, his words about how I was wrong and twisting his words. A few seconds later, and I turned to the king, my psyche nudging everyone's attention back to me. Your Majesty, King Distrian Jelvin Alphen, I'd like to propose something to you. As a soldier, and as an inventor whose products have served the kingdom for the better. The king's brows raised, the marshal of the royal guard standing beside his chair glaring at me with scrutiny. Hook, the king waved. Go on, Sir Cooper. My proposal is thus. Place a stronghold in this position. Arm it with the standard allotment of troops. And then, allow me to outfit the entire stronghold and its forces with my machines of war. My technology goes beyond simple tanks and planes. I have personal armor, sensors, structural enchantments, tools and weapons that can deliver magical attacks from miles away. The stronghold will be an impenetrable fortress as it will be the source of ruin for the Scourge. I ask that you give Son Industries, the rights to dictate the type of warfare this stronghold fights with, and I will bring you victory. When the Scourge's intestine arrives, and as those armies of millions march on that desert, as they inevitably will, I will eradicate them from the face of this world, and I will deliver unto you a level of victory that hasn't been seen in centuries. I don't need 300,000 troops that will turn into mere fodder like those at the treehouse did. I just need a tenth of that, and I will turn them into the most effective army this world has ever known. The hall was silent under my proposal, the gaze of 4 sovereigns and many more marshals and brigadiers boring through my being. It was a massive amount of pressure to be under, but I gave no hint of my stress. Line. The king pondered for a few dozen seconds, his smile slowly growing wide. He couldn't contain his excitement. You're telling me, Sir Cooper, that you will bring me what no other general has brought me in centuries? That you and your technology are the key to this war? That, by giving you control of a small base with a mere 30,000 troops, you'll be able to bring me victory over the millions of Scourge currently occupying that mountain range. Your Majesty, a million Scourge means a million crystals, and I've also designed special mass crystal harvesters for the battlefield. I smiled at him. Give me a couple years, and I'll bring you, not other nobles, but you, half of them. The king smiled even wider. And Sinker, you make a tempting proposal, Sir Cooper. Chapter 249, Selfish Man. He had it in the bag. When the doors opened for intermission, all Amara could hear was shouting. She, like many of the other +1s that had spent the first half of the day's meeting sleeping, was supposed to enter during intermission, but none of them could find it in them to take the first step forward. It was a madhouse, and Amara wasn't very surprised to see her boyfriend at the center of it. They cannot match the cargo efficiency of the rails. We have documented numbers dating back decades. You want numbers? You're going to ask a summoner about numbers? The Duke seemed to shrink back. Indeed, it was stupid to challenge a summoner with numbers. Even then, John threw up a projector with a massive display of comparison data, not just for his planes, but for his own specially designed trains. Unlike your inefficient rails, my trains don't need anything more than 2 metal tracks to travel. They only need a set of crystals in the main engine. Unlike rails that need crystals across the entire length of their damn tracks. My trains are also faster. They can run indefinitely. They cost a magnitude less to install. And you dare to bring up cargo efficiency. I could hardly give a damn that you have decades of data utilizing inferior technology. Amara sighed. John was definitely smart, but if she had to think of any flaw, it would be that he got quite testy when someone questioned his logic. It was almost impossible to do so, which meant that anybody daring to was probably just too stupid or stubborn to understand what he was saying in the first place and yield. This was the case here, and it caused him to yell at a duke like he was some common baron. After Amara had taken the first step to enter, she took John's side and held his arm. She had decided to wear her black dress again today since John hadn't changed either, having pulled an all-nighter. She had to match him. Then the rest of the meeting continued. Intermission was outright disregarded as John went back and forth with other nobles. Most of those concerned with what he had said before were attempting to argue their way toward a better position, because it was beginning to look like John was trying to take everything for himself. But there were also those silent nobles that pondered not how to knock John down, but how to ride his coattails. Amara hadn't realized the significance of what had transpired until the meeting ended. That night, she had a brief private discussion with her mother where she heard about what John had proposed so boldly to the king. The fact that he did so wasn't very shocking to Amara. It was the fact that it seemed to have worked that multiplied her stress. Talexia was forced into a situation where she had to support John, and yet she managed to stay quiet, simply allowing John to shut down opposition in the hall. A smart play, because it would be up to them to handle the work behind the scenes, and that would be more difficult if they had appeared as headstrong as John did. And so Amara had several times the amount of work on her plate. She spent her entire night bouncing between meetings with other nobles, with and without John. She already knew what his goals were. Nothing that he said and argued for was spur of the moment. It was all planned out beforehand, and she had learned all of what she needed to know about his operations and plans during the 2 months she followed him while he revolutionized. She just hadn't expected that he would try and tempt the king personally. If it had failed, then they'd be in deep shit, but his gamble had worked. Perhaps it was never a gamble in the first place, though. John was reckless from the perspective of others, but that was because they couldn't see what he did. Perhaps it only took the first meeting, or a mere few words with the king, to discover that he could be effectively enticed, to discover the right things to say. Not even Amara could figure out what John saw, and she couldn't quite fathom his deductive abilities, but she knew she could trust him. He took risks, but she knew they were all calculated, hardly risks after he thought about them long enough. So the third day came. It was the day for the king to make his decrees. The meeting didn't start until noon of the third day. Everyone was tense and tired when they entered, exhaustion from long hours of discussion and political maneuvering setting in all at once. Yet they drank their concoctions and slapped themselves awake, because today was the one day they couldn't afford to miss. The table was filled, not a single empty spot to be found. In front of everyone was a large map, the same one they had used to decide on the position of new bases across the front. There were several minutes of idle silence and muted whispering as the king simply sat there. All could tell that he was deep in deliberation, only once glancing at John. Then, he finally stood from his seat, reaching over to a panel before him and tapping on a smaller image of the map. We will establish 2 new strongholds and 1 new supply post. They will be placed as such. The 3 locations appeared for everyone to see. The supply post was not far behind the 2 new strongholds, and one of the strongholds was exactly where John had asked it to be. The other was slightly more to the northeast, a good position to ensure the Scourge didn't simply rout the other stronghold, similar to how the treehouse had operated as a secondary barrier for Stronghold Charlie. The king continued, "The supply post will have a direct connection to the city of Valence. As for the line connecting it, Gearworks and Son Industries will engage in an auction, the lowest bidder being awarded the contract to construct the new line, either rail or train." Murmuring was heard, and Amara glanced across the table. Sumas Pavlos, the owner of Gearworks, was frowning in obvious distaste. Son Industries was slated to take all their business if John's boasts were true. They had come up with better alternatives to all of Gearworks' best products, such as the Steed and Rail. John was also boasting that they were cheaper while being significantly more efficient. Well, the Mana engine was a monumental breakthrough. Anything it was applied to was automatically guaranteed to be better. The only reason Gearworks hadn't yet panicked was because there simply hadn't been enough time for Son Industries to invade the market. But that just meant that, in time, they would. And it seemed to be starting with this. As for the city of Valence, she and John had been there before. It was where they had sent the survivors from the village south of Stronghold Charlie. They had only been there a short time. The city was the main hub for Northwestern Transit to and from the River of Desolation. All the facilities there were already more than capable of handling the establishment of another stronghold, so it made sense that it would be the checkpoint for logistics. But a new line still had to be built. The line to Stronghold Charlie was naturally off-limits, and while its initial length could be reused and redirected, John was promising a far cheaper, faster, and more efficient option. Hence the auction. Amara knew they would win it. John would have a criminally high profit margin even after Gearworks got to the point of forsaking profits and bleeding coin. After murmuring died down, the king looked toward John. Amara had to keep herself from tensing. Unlike John, who never seemed to give a damn about status due to his upbringing in another world entirely, the king was still the highest existence she knew of. John had been taught that kings were fools to be laughed at. She had been taught that if she desecrated the king's name, she'd bring down herself and her entire family. It was stressful, being the target of his scrutiny, even more so when the four sovereigns turned their gazes as the king did. John Cooper, you promised to bring me victory and 500,000 crystals. I did, Your Majesty, and my promise still stands. I know it does, but convincing my generals to give you control over a new stronghold has been difficult. More than that, convincing those who have the manpower to muster even just 30,000 soldiers has been fruitless. However, I know you have support, so I will offer the opportunity anyway. The king smiled, Amara using her peripheral vision to see that John remained completely unperturbed. In fact, a small smile was on his face. John Cooper, I will allow you and those who support you to muster the soldiers by buying contracts. If you can find soldiers who are willing to sell their contracts to you, then you may have them and assemble them. However, there are naturally conditions. First, you must have a contracted general and marshal at all times. Second, you must operate jointly with kingdom forces. Third, you must provide for the needs of your troops yourself. This includes everything from food to equipment, as nothing standard issue from the kingdom will be provided since it is contracted. Of course, this also means that if you manage to buy more than 30,000 contracts, you won't be stopped. Amara's eyes were round when the king finally paused, John remaining silent for a short time. Like her, dozens of others were floored by the offer. An independent military force. Ever since the kingdom had been founded some centuries ago, it hadn't truly existed in any significant capacity. However, nobles always had their own reserve forces. It was why the question of manpower wasn't so cut and dry. Nobles wanted to defend their own territories, so sending all of the valuable magi beyond the River of Desolation to simply die like they did at the treehouse wasn't tempting. John had told Amara that there would likely be mass recalls if things kept going as they were. Nobles would begin pulling troops that came from their territories back so that they could muster their own defenses instead of fighting in a collective effort. Once upon a time, that had been normal. Even in kingdom law, high nobles, such as a border marquis or a duke, could maintain their own armies. But it wasn't cost-effective in the last century or so. Nobles had done away with them, mostly. But now, it seemed like John had received so much opposition that not even the king could get nobles and generals to support throwing a measly 30,000 troops at him. Nobody was going to help John. Nobody wanted to put skin in his game, no matter how little. And yet the king seemed to want it to happen anyway. Despite everything, despite all the opposition to the idea, despite the sovereigns likely having given their bad word, he still presented the opportunity. Perhaps those 500,000 crystals truly were that enticing. Perhaps the king wanted to exercise some of his power that other nobles seemed to be refusing to legitimize. Perhaps it was because the king would be winning no matter what happened. Perhaps they were using this as an opportunity to let John knock himself down, expecting him to fail. Or maybe it was as simple as the king wanting some entertainment, taking a stupid gamble. Regardless, the opportunity was there, and John was smiling widely. Amara couldn't help the smile either. She heard her mother softly sigh, likely anticipating what was soon to come. A lot of gold would be leaving their coffers. The king took the silence and continued. You will be allowed to do as your capabilities determine. If everything you've said about your new technologies is true, then that shouldn't be too much of a problem. I am very interested in seeing how you would manage to live up to the claims. If you decide to take on this perilous task. John gave a short pause before answering, still grinning like a madman. Your Majesty, it would be my honor to take on this task. I know many don't believe in my words, but that just means I can take this opportunity to showcase the strength of what I have built. Of course, if the time ever comes that high officials see the merit of my technology and wish to integrate it into their forces, I will be more than happy to offer services just as I have for my planes. Until then, I will work toward victory, just as I have promised. Very well, Sir Cooper. The details will naturally be spoken about in depth, but the scourge does not wait for humanity. It is in our best interest to establish our grounds as quickly as possible so that you can begin your work. For this purpose, I invite you to stay another day at the royal palace. I graciously accept this invitation. I, too, am eager to begin development. Then it is settled. The king gave his decree. John Cooper will henceforth be the operating commander of the newly designated stronghold to be named at his discretion. In tandem, the newly designated stronghold Echo will act as the primary defensive position of the kingdom, protecting the flank of our lines from the scourge. John continued to smile, and the king went on to detail several other decrees. There were some new taxes instituted, some new drafting orders, some reshuffling that would all help to support the creation of a new foothold. Recovering from a massive blow such as the destruction of Stronghold Charlie wasn't impossible, but it would take a lot of money and human resources. Given that none of the nobles wanted to pay the cost, the king was simply using his power to force the issue with decrees that would move pieces across the board and push past the inertia. But Amara could hardly be bothered with any of that. She continued to glance at John, her hands slipping into his, the two of them clasping each other tightly. She could tell he was excited. If there was anything John liked, it was being in control of himself, of his circumstances, and anything else that might affect his goals or life. This would be their greatest investment, and it was clear that he was ready to make it. Everything would be over if they failed, but if they didn't, they would have unprecedented power, which was also why they would have to be careful, not just of the scourge, but of those around them who might feel threatened. Thankfully, though, they also had people they could trust. Amara was excited to see what would happen. It was an endlessly daunting road ahead, but she wasn't scared. This was far better than being at the mercy of those who didn't care, or worse. She'd rather become an intelligence agent and work the desk all day than put herself and her loved ones in the position she had been in only a few months ago. Her heart pounded as she thought about what was to come. Like that, a few more hours went by, the king finally finishing his decrees. It was far from the end of the deliberations. After the meeting ended, there would be an endless stream of meetings. She would be in many of them. But then, she sensed something. She glanced at John when she noticed the anomaly. It wasn't with anything else, but with him. He was nervous? Made sense, considering what he had just gotten himself into. But it felt different. Finally, the meeting came to its conclusion. The king sat back in his seat, taking a sip of water after having spoken without end. He raised a parchment, reading from it. That, ladies and gentlemen, seems to be the end of my decrees. Is there anything else that must be made known or decided on? Silence prevailed, until several seconds later, John stood from his seat. The king's brows raised. Yes, Sir Cooper? Your Majesty, if I may be so bold. A bit late to ask, but very well. My thanks. He said that before suddenly stepping up onto the table. Amara gawked in confusion, glancing around to see shocked, curious, and a few hostile gazes. Then, she suddenly felt her hand get pulled. It hadn't left his, their fingers still tightly locked together. John. Amara resisted slightly, terrified when she stepped onto the top of the table. It felt like she was dirtying something sacred, or perhaps crossing a line she never thought she'd ever cross. She was fully on the table, standing high above everyone else who remained in their seats. Nearly everyone in the room was immensely powerful, sitting at the chief, brigadier, marshal, and even sovereign level. They couldn't threaten but the weakest of those around the table, so nobody had a particularly lethal response to the sudden change of events. Yet she felt like she was naked as her adrenaline spiked, every eye on her and John. She was screaming across their telepathic connection. John, what the fuck are you outdoing? Amara, Erica, Teleria. Another shot of adrenaline surged through her system when she saw John lower himself to one knee. He hadn't even kneeled for the king, and yet here he was, with a little box in his hand. He gazed up at her, Amara glancing at the box, then into his eyes. That hint of nervousness inside him was gone. He couldn't care less about those around them, or about the insanity of this stunt. His eyes were on her. Only her. I have traversed the universe and have placed myself at the front of the fight against an inhuman enemy spawned from the depths of hell. And yet I am a selfish man who now refuses to be without you in my fight. Still, I will ask. He opened the box, revealing the beautiful, glimmering ring. Will you marry me, Amara? She stared, almost mute from the consecutive shocks of crazy events. She barely even noticed a tear escaping her eye, but she nodded. Even as she wiped her face and found those simple words, she hurriedly nodded. Yes, yes, I'll marry you, you crazy man. She dove over and wrapped her arms around his neck, Amara smiling through tears as John chuckled, the two hugging on their knees. Then, there was a clap. The king smacked his hands together, the pace rising until he was giving applause. The rest of those in the meeting hall joined, the king erupting into laughter. Ha ha, bold indeed. Amara finally separated once she again realized that they were still on top of the table. Then she flushed as that embarrassment compounded with the excitement of feeling John slip the ring onto her finger. Then he kissed her, making it all the more worse. Chapter 250. Escape. 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 Tana grit her teeth as the screaming threatened to make her ears burst. She barely felt the blood dripping from her eyes and nose. Her heart beating at over 250 BPM and climbing as adrenaline flooded her body. She ran and clawed her way to escape, but she couldn't seem to find it amid the razor spikes that filled the complex. You will die. You will not escape, you will die. I will hollow out your fucking skull. Tana cried more blood as she continued to run through the labyrinth despite the floors being covered in jagged metal that sliced her feet. She reminded herself that it wasn't real every second, but there had already been a few points through her escape that she had stopped believing that. She didn't know what to believe anymore. She wasn't sure if the floors really were jagged metal or if the spikes that occasionally shot out of the walls and drove through her heart were real. The times that she should have died, when she had collapsed in a pool of blood due to her unreal wounds, she passed out and woke back up an unknown number of hours later. It was a cycle of torment. The only way to win was to escape, but she had yet to find the exit. Every time she thought she was on the right path, felt in her soul that she was going the right way, Apocryon would show up at the end of a hallway. And the wounds he gave her then were very real. She knew because those wounds were the ones that made her body react, that pushed her toward the feeling of death that she had experienced back then at Purple Sky. They scared her. Once, she tried to push through it anyway, tried to ignore the horror and push through Apocryon's attacks, even if it meant her real death. That time, she had been driven so far into instinctual, life-preserving madness that she had actually managed to fight her way out of Apocryon's vicinity, escaping back into the labyrinth. Normally, that would have been impossible. He was 3 authorities above her and one of the smartest warlocks to ever live. Yet she had managed. That madness had pushed her to an edge she didn't realize she had. But it came at a cost. The vivid memories of that time were the only things that helped her remain disbelieving of the illusions in the labyrinth. But with every spike of pain, with every gaze upon Apokryon, her baseline seemed to be driven further into that madness. She had long lost track of the hours and days. She didn't know if the king's assembly was over, but she knew that she had her limit, and it was approaching. She was hyper-aware as she pushed through the labyrinth, her eyes bleeding as she pushed her senses to such high levels that her body strained to keep up. The labyrinth was endless. Apokryon wouldn't allow her to escape him. She knew that just as she knew the pain he could inflict, but she pushed through anyway, refusing to believe there was no way out. The madness wouldn't allow her to give in. Darkness encroached all around her. As she spent longer in the labyrinth, darkness started to invade. The gray metal spikes faded to black as she bled on them. The floors were coated in black footprints as she ran across them. The air was filled with light drinking fog as she heaved for air. It was surrounding her, left everywhere she walked. It took her some time to realize the darkness was coming from her. She didn't know why. Plex would tell her that it was the other half of the answer. He would tell her that her body was already dead. It was why she was able to wield her aura to disappear at all. She would tell him that he was spewing bullshit, that John could easily see through her, that Amara could find her anyway. He would tell her that she was visible not because her body was visible. Her body had already died. She would realize that John's power of the mind made him her perfect counter. Escape, 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 escape. Apocryon's voice screamed from everywhere and nowhere. Tana felt herself crack further. She knew she couldn't take it much longer. She was desperately trying to live. Yet her body continued to move through the spikes. It continued to get impaled as she walked through traps. She felt every fiber of her being screaming at her to survive, the madness taking over. And yet as Plex watched from outside, all he could see was her calmly treading normal stone halls. Not running, not panicking, but walking with a measured stride. He saw the darkness blooming from her, coating Apocryon's castle with her aura. It wasn't simply darkness. When it spread from the castle and touched those outside of it, touched the guards who had gone back to their normal patrols, they would all freeze. And then they'd draw their blades and slit their own throats. Plex recognized the darkness. Yet when it touched him, he didn't so much as flinch. He had already rationalized despair. The medium of death to most, the medium of damnation to those who understood. But Apokryon was unique. He hadn't simply rationalized despair. He had adopted it, had become it. He carried it almost as the king itself did, but because he lacked the sheer power, he couldn't match. But it was more than enough for a kid like Tana. More than enough to overwhelm her. If she really escaped, then she'd get the respite she needed to rationalize despair. Yet, that was exactly the reason why Plex said she'd only get one chance. She wasn't meant to rationalize despair. That wouldn't help her disappear. Thankfully, she knew that escaping meant she'd lose. Her mind may not know, may believe the opposite, but her body understood. She was torn between them, unable to decide. The mind of a human was a powerful thing. Those who had fought the scourge and had gone through some of the worst things a human could imagine had minds capable of miracles. She hadn't known that her mental strength was precisely the thing holding her back. Plex knew what she needed. He didn't know if she would come out of this properly, but all parties involved knew the risk. This wasn't even Plex's idea. It had just taken him some time to understand why he had been asked to throw a girl into the maws of the devil. And he had been asked to watch, so here he was, watching a girl kill herself. He watched Tana march through Apocryon's castle. Whenever she encountered him, she'd run away, and then once she was far away, she'd turn right back around and march toward Apokryon again. Her body knew what it needed to complete itself. It just needed to convince her mind to take the plunge. Slowly but surely there was progress, but every time she got close to the answer, anarchy would kick in and save her. But just as her body started to break, so too did her mind. Plex watched as she was chipped and cracked, as her mind reached its breaking point, was repaired just slightly, and pushed to its limit once more. Over and over again, she just barely dodged true death. Over and over again, she experienced why Apokryon was so feared. But she always went back. Her body knew. Her mind started to get quiet enough to let her body take over. And then she reached the threshold. Plex could see it as it happened. He watched Tana walk right back toward Apokryon, and then watched Apokryon attack her with fanatical rage. He had started to enjoy himself, and yet his own pain left no room for mercy. He attacked to maim, torture, and kill, but she managed to keep herself alive. She never attacked. She only dodged. She danced around Apokryon's death, suffering horrible wounds in the process. Her eyes were cloudy, her lucidity cracking as Apokryon's aura inflicted hellish pressure on her very soul. But this time was different, because she wasn't escaping. Plex narrowed his eyes, got closer. He watched the ground shatter as a metal spike drove through Tana's leg. She tore herself out of it as if she couldn't feel it, yet she remained crippled. She used her arms to maneuver with her one good leg, and yet some minutes later one of her arms was sliced, barely escaping total amputation, yet still suffering severed tendons. It fell limp, and Plex could almost hear Tana's heart pounding in her chest. Blood sprayed from her wounds, and for a second, Plex saw her body twitch, a cry of madness that demanded she escape. Yet as soon as the initial movement to escape came, it faded. A barbed conical spike drove through her abdomen, raising her off the floor and preventing her from escaping for good. Her eyes went blank. Her mind seemed to collapse, Apocryon's aura completely invading her body, attempting to snuff out her soul. Apokryon didn't kill the flesh. The mad warlock's body floated up to her laughing in glee. His aura completely washed hers out. Plex couldn't feel a hint of it. Apokryon cackled, the depth of his madness echoing through the trenches. Plex could already sense the order getting closer. Powerful assassins drawing their blades in preparation. He felt Tana's heart beating so fast that he thought it might explode, until it suddenly stopped, Apokryon's grin widening, his hands reaching for her head. So Plex stepped in. He broke the spike impaling Tana, launched an attack at Apokryon that the man blocked easily, and fled. He carried Tana's dead body out of the castle, Apokryon screaming in madness as he gave chase. The order stepped in simultaneously, Apokryon coming under attack, holy formations glowing in the dark and poisonous atmosphere of the trenches. Plex simply ran, bringing Tana's body away to the Founders Market where he found a hospital. John had frequented this one often. Little did he know, Plex ascended to the top of the building, kicking open the door of an office and finding the person inside already standing, staring out a window. Is there a reason I must be annoyed with these things, Plex? Come on, Zober. Don't be a bitter asshole. Plex placed Tana's body on a nearby couch, her wounds dripping, her heart still. Zober, the gray-haired old man standing at the window with wrinkles that counted as years, turned with an exasperated glare. Plex smiled. If you could just give her some light healing. Close up the wounds. You've brought me a corpse. How much do you want then? I've got a blank check. The point isn't money. You think the order is here to clean up your messes whenever you please to make them? Even further, you've gone and decimated your careful relationship with Apokryon. We guaranteed him one thing. Sleep. You couldn't wait until he at least woke up to piss him off. Bah. You wouldn't understand, wrinkled dick. The fuck did you call me? Zober's face reddened in rage, Plex bracing for the river of slurs that soon followed. He stood there, letting the rage vent while dodging the occasional attack. Then, he suddenly looked back at the couch. His eyes widened. Hang on. What now, you fucking Windash? She's gone. Plex pointed, Zober's face snapping to the side to see the body gone. Plex stared, then started smiling. She's gone. How about that? Yeah, and now my couch is soaked in blood. Buy me a new one. Sure. Not like I'm the one footing the bill. Anyway, my work here is done. I'm going home to sleep. Hang on. Zober chased as Plex fled. March 6th, 626. I sighed while stepping out of the royal palace. Despite my powerful mind, I was exhausted. More so socially than mentally. I had done enough talking for years. Since I was now responsible for raising an army of my own that would go on to build and man a stronghold, there were a lot of details to flesh out. I had to settle contract buys with the king and then with other generals. Then I had to speak with the king about a new contract for my armament since the military wanted more planes, bombs, helicopters, and now vehicles. Then there was the auction, which we easily won against Gearworks. Then discussions with Telexia and Chief Ironheart for the purpose of getting soldiers from them. Then making plans with San to quickly move forward with building a supply line beyond the River of Desolation to start the construction of the new stronghold quickly. For that I needed to design a stronghold as well. Discussions with the City Lord of Valence about the train. Another discussion with Telexia about the sudden marriage proposal. Discussions with San and a select few generals about a mass funeral I wanted to put together for the fallen of the Treehouse and Stronghold Charlie. There were many things to speak about. It felt like there weren't enough minutes in the day, even though I moved as fast and spoke as efficiently as possible. Even Amara was overworked, making deals with other nobles in order to ensure we had some measure of political support instead of pure opposition. According to her, Vatsy played smart and gave his assistance. Its extent was questionable to me, but I let her deal with that, promising to let her do her job. Things ended about how I wanted them to, but it still left us drained. Amara leaned on me as we walked, more exhausted than I was. Not sure if I would have rather been on the battlefield. Yeah. I nodded in agreement, seeing my helicopter on a pad, Boris standing beside it, waiting to take us to the wedded city. I needed to speak with the chief more, because we'd be working together extensively. I didn't actually intend to buy so many contracts, and the chief of the Raven family expressed interest in supplying the manpower to compose my army. Not all of it, but most. I was keen to work with him because it would mean I had an army that wasn't loyal to some noble or kingdom territory, but to the wedded city itself. That would give me supreme control over the troops. It would make them my troops, but we'd also get to rest in the wedded city, so Amara and I were eager to get out of here. I wondered how Tana was doing. I left her with Plex a while ago, but I had yet to hear anything. Probably because I'd been locked in the palace. Just as I thought that, though, I felt my spine tingle, noticing a gaze on me. A gaze I hadn't sensed until I noticed it walking up to me, only some feet away. "Barrier!" I shouted, Amara reacting instantly, her barrier appearing around us not even a quarter of a second after I started moving, before my word even came out. Totenstall appeared, and I raised it as she prepared spells, the two of us aiming at the source of the threat. And when my barrel was raised, I saw a familiar face. My eyes widened, seeing Tana bloodied and on the verge of death. Totenstall's barrel rested inches from her eye socket, my finger already placing light pressure on the trigger, Amara's barrier right between the end of the barrel and Tana's face. "John," Amara called when I ceased my actions, clearly unable to see Tana. I sighed, sending Totenstall away. "It's fine, Amara. It's just Tana." "Huh? Where is she?" "Right here." Tana smiled, suddenly falling to her knees. I went down and caught her, the blood on her body wetting my suit. Amara seemed to see her at that moment, her eyes widening. "Tana, the hell happened?" "I did it," Tana muttered through weak lungs. I could feel her heart pounding out of her chest. She was utterly exhausted, her skin pale, flushed in some places. Her limbs looked weak, her muscles having shrunk, by my guess due to rhabdomyolysis. She had reached beyond her limits. And if what I wasn't seeing was true, then she had succeeded. I made a quick decision. We're heading to the Tavera family. They'll have a good healer. I picked Tana up, Amara running with me to the helicopter. I gave Boris his destination, and we were in the air promptly. It was a short hop to the Founders Market where I jumped out of the helicopter with Tana in my arms, landing right in the middle of the Tavera estate. The Patriarch was quick to greet us. "John, what are you doing here?" "Patriarch, I could use a healer." He looked at Tana, now passed out. He seemed distrained to see her, but since I was in contact with her, he didn't have much trouble. He looked to the side and shouted, "Get Noemi." Quickly, a guard ran off, getting the healer as we went to the Tavera's own hospital. They were a knight family and naturally had healers specializing in treating them. Noemi appeared and quickly went over Tana, cringing at the damage, throwing a dozen different recovery pills into her mouth and getting to work. I made sure to have Amara keep a hand on Tana. I noticed when I let go that others weren't able to see her. It was like she didn't exist until she came in contact with someone. Then again, even without anyone touching her, I could see her just fine. I couldn't sense her walking up to me in the Royal Plaza, but I hadn't had trouble seeing her. She just didn't have aura. Not a drop. I'd have to talk to her later about it. But for now, it seems like she succeeded in reaching her goal. She just needed to recover from what Apocreon did to her. After letting the healers stabilize Tana, I thanked the Patriarch and tried to give some compensation. He refused, instead speaking to me about his desire to send some Tavera soldiers to my army, including some of his children and grandchildren, so that they could get good experience. I agreed to take him up on the offer. A rough estimate from him said that he'd send at least a few hundred people. It wasn't much, but I was taking what I could get at this point. More importantly, the Patriarch was someone I wanted to keep on my good side, considering he and the previous Patriarch had some connection with the church. With the deal made, I brought Tana with us to the wedded city. Phaidon would also be meeting us there, hopefully recovering well from his new crown and invocation.